Guess what? I'm talking about the jail again. And not just any jail, I'm talking about the history of the Scottish prison system. Right for the days of public executions, up into the modern times, a HMP Glasgow, and everything in between. This is a big fat HMP sandwich. So sit down, get cosy, get some munchies, and get your notifications off. And most importantly, get the Patsies out. I'm Hawaii 5-0. This is Patsy Crime.
Disclaimer, content in this video has been created strictly for educational and investigational purposes. There is no intention to glamorise or endorse criminality or any aspect of crime. The information in this video has been acquired online from publicly available sources.
You see, before the 18th century, there wasn't really such a thing as custodial sentences in Scotland. They were much simpler times, right? Where the preferred method of punishment for minor offences would take the form of getting put in stocks and essentially sentenced to public embarrassment, where the local community could exact some local justice by flinging rotten food, stones, and even some well-worded insults at you. Whereas for mid-level offences, we'd see you getting tied to the back of a cart and whipped repeatedly across the back or the shoulders a set number of times, which would be decided by a court. Such crimes that would result in this punishment were petty theft, adultery, begging, public drunkenness, and even slander. Just as well Scottish TikTok never existed back then, eh? Please laugh. And of course, for the most severe crimes resulted in good old public executions. That's how they solved overcrowding back then. But as time went on, people progressed, attitudes changed, and people realised locking somebody in wooden stocks so they could publicly berate them whilst flinging their minging fruit at them probably wasn't the most effective form of rehabilitation. Many people thought it was merely a spectacle rather than a deterrent, and it was more about brutalising offenders rather than addressing the real issues at hand. So, this led to the formation of the Bridewells. You see, the Bridewell Palace in London was a royal residence built in 1515 by King Henry VIII, but it was repurposed in 1553 under King Edward VI as one of the first houses of correction in England. Located near the River Fleet, the palace became a facility to punish and reform vagrants, petty criminals and prostitutes through hard labour and strict discipline. Its fresh focus on rehabilitation rather than physical punishment set a new standard for dealing with minor offenders. In 1798, Glasgow established its own Bridewell and adopted the same model, focusing on confining offenders and using labour such as thread making and weaving as a means of moral and social reform. The Glasgow Bridewell became a symbol of the city's attempt to modernise its approach to crime and punishment, reflecting the influence of Bridewell Palace's groundbreaking shift towards institutional correction. Did it work? Aye, for about 5 minutes. You see, what the Bridewells managed to achieve, right, was removing vagrants and petty criminals from the streets. But the thing is, with these types of criminals, most of them are committing crime out of necessity, as a means of survival, due to the fact you didn't have an arse in your trousers. So although the Bridewells was an attempt to modernise Scotland's approach to the penal system, it never really solved the issues that caused people to offend. And back then, that was the least of its worries. You see, one of the biggest issues the Bridewells faced was the problem of, drum roll, can you guess it? Aye, you guessed it. Overcrowding. As if we haven't heard that one before, know what I mean? Apparently reports for the early 19th century describe prisoners crammed into small cells, with some facilities housing double or triple the number of inmates they were designed for. You even had inmates sharing beds or sleeping on the flares due to the lack of space. In some cases, you had 4 cons sharing a single bed. Wouldn't want to be smelling nail farts, let me tell you. But I suppose that would make you grateful for getting tap bunked, eh? There was also a lack of ventilation in cells, which brought on illnesses like tuberculosis, which was common in 19th century Scotland. And unsurprisingly, cons went without access to toilets or washing facilities, contributing to outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhus. Many cells had only a bucket to empty your bowels into, which remained a staple in the prison system up until recent years. But we'll get to that. All in all, it was a diseased dungeon infested with rats and lice. Meals consisted of bread, porridge, and sometimes soup, so malnutrition was very high. In order to deter offenders from committing further crime, plus reshaping them into upstanding members of society, they had them spinning yarns, whoppering as we say these days, weaving and breaking stones. Also spinning yarns is an old thing that wasn't always tied to line, but see, these physically demanding tasks were intended to instill discipline and deter laziness, which authorities at the time often associated with criminal behaviour. I've yet to hear the guy that got done with death by dangerous lazy bastardness. In a way, I suppose they were right. A lazy criminal is a captured criminal. But with the likes of yarn spinning and weaving, they were a massive part of the textile industry, which was a massive sector in the 17th and 18th century. The output for prisoners' labour could be sold to generate income for the Bridewell itself, offsetting operational costs. Finished products like thread or fabric could be supplied to local markets or used by the community. Stonebreaking provided raw materials for public infrastructure such as roads and buildings, and this helped improve local infrastructure while keeping costs low for the community. And although these types of labour did serve the community in a sense, with the materials being created at low cost, it didn't really do that much in order to install any transferable skills like criminals could use when released back into the communities. In fact, there was actually a lot of critics of the regime that felt that labour was just exploitation, and the fact it never equipped inmates with any meaningful skills and actually contributed to high rates of reoffending. Eventually, the cost of running the Bridewells far exceeded the production it could put out. It was only a matter of time before they realised it was well past its sell-by date. And at the time, the Scottish prison system was run by local boroughs. There was hardly any structure or organisation put in place that could oversee the running of these facilities in order to maintain efficiency and basic hygiene. So this would lead to lawmakers passing the 1839 Prisons Scotland Act, with the goal of moving towards creating a unified and humane prison system. See, for the first time, Scotland had a centralised authority to oversee its jails, known as the Scottish Prison Board. This new board's goal was to be tasked with surveying existing prisons and introducing uniform standards across the country. Then in 1842, the board would open Scotland's first national prison, which is still in operation today, known as HMP Perth. In 1810, the land where HMP Perth now stands was originally bought for the Moncrief family to house French prisoners of war captured during the Napoleonic Wars. Designed by government architect Robert Reid, the depot held up to 7,000 prisoners at its peak. That's some amount of overcrowding, let me tell you. Many prisoners were confined, but others were granted unique freedoms. French officers lived with local families under parole agreements, promising not to escape. Obviously, there was a few that did try to put the boot down, but were they successful? Partially. Because although they did make it back to France, they were sent back by the French government to preserve the honour of the parole system. It's the French for you, I suppose. When the war ended in 1815, the prisoners were sent packing. After they left, the depot became a military store. But in 1839, the depot was chosen as the site for Scotland's first national prison. Modelled after Joshua Jebb's Pentonville design, the General Prison at Perth featured 4 radiating wings, each capable of housing 160 inmates. Perth Prison opened in 1842. It was a unisex jail with male and female screws running the show, and even had Scotland's most criminally insane, earning comparisons to Broadmoor Asylum. You see, Perth was Scotland's attempt to shift from the brutal regime at the Bridewells to a more modernised approach. One of the approaches the new jail included was individual cells to house the prisoners, whereas the Bridewells had men, women and even wains occupying cells imprisoned for a whole number of offences. The powers that be felt that categorising inmates based on gender and the severity of the crime would reduce moral contamination, quote unquote. You see, you're wondering what moral contamination is, right? That was a phrase used back then to describe instances where certain prisoners who might not be fully fledged criminals or might be vulnerable would be corrupted by associating with people who were involved in criminality of a more serious nature. Flying with the crows, not what I'm talking about. The concept of moral contamination was central to the philosophy behind Perth. Reformers thought that by isolating inmates and categorising them, it would stop the spread of criminal habits and attitudes One of the methods that Perth decided would complement rehabilitation was solitary confinement, which was enforced to promote reflection with the hopes of encouraging moral reform. We'll just lock you up in a room and have you think about it. But that's the thing, that wasn't the only method they used. Right, listen, the prison also enforced religion. The cons basically had to go to chapel, which were led by prison chaplains. The services focused on repentance, moral instruction, and the pursuit of spiritual salvation. Because of course, the problem wasn't poverty, it wasn't deprivation, or even society. It was clearly God no being about. That was it. In 1870, the jail became the site of Britain's first private execution when George Chalmers, a vagrant from Bracco, was hanged within its walls after public executions were abolished in 1868. So they stopped hanging people outside, but they just started doing it in the jails. But this wasn't the only notoriety the prison would achieve in its history. During the suffragette movement in the early 20th century, where women campaigned for the right to vote in parliamentary election, many women were arrested and even jailed for their involvement for what was seen as militant action. But upon imprisonment, the suffragettes would take on the status of political prisoners and not common criminals. And in order to highlight recognition of their cause and protest their treatment in prison, they would go on hunger strikes. So how does Perth come into it? You're probably wondering. It's because Perth was the only jail that had the facilities to force feed hunger striking suffragettes, where they get restrained, have a rubber tube shoved in their throat, and then have liquid food poured in the tube into their stomach. That's one way to get a scran in you, not on top of it. As time went on, people quickly realised that solitary confinement and religious bob-ashing techniques weren't having the desired effect. In actual fact, a lot of cons experienced depression, anxiety, and even insanity due to the lack of human interaction. Shock horror. Critics, including reformers and chaplains, started questioning whether solitary confinement was humane or effective. Joseph John Gurney, a minister and prison reformer who, in his written piece, notes in a visit made to some of the prisons in Scotland and the north of England, very catchy title, stated, "The system of solitary confinement, if too far extended, tends to undermine the mental faculties and to produce a morbid state of mind." And you want to know who else had an opinion on this? Charles Dickens. He had an opinion on solitary confinement, describing it as a form of torture. He said, "I am persuaded that those who designed this system do not know what it is that they are doing. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." Some boy. Plus, Perth's attempts to rehabilitate offenders for committing further crimes was a complete failure, as a high percentage of people released re-offended. A quote for Caledonian Mercury in 1848 criticised Perth for its failure to reduce recidivism and claimed that as many as 2/3 of prisoners released for Perth re-offended, stating, "Despite its progressive reforms and separation system, the general prison at Perth has become a revolving door for offenders. Warmth, food and solitude, these comforts alien to the lives of the poorest, seem to encourage men to return willingly." So it seems that societal issues like poverty were still contributing to crime, and even the harshest of penal punishment wasn't enough to deter people from breaking the law. It was time for the Scottish Prison Board to return to the drawing board. Whee! Come on, give a laugh for that, man. Come on, geez it. He smiled. But see, the ineffectiveness of Perth's rehabilitations wasn't the only problem they were up against. You see, the Industrial Revolution, which was also in the 19th century, established Glasgow as an industrial shipping hub, which meant plenty of opportunities for employment. Woohoo! But we were soon to discover Glasgow was the birthplace of a very different kind of revolution. This was an era where poverty was rife, people flocked to Glasgow, and quite quickly the population boomed. Unfortunately though, the shipping industry was unable to cope with the high volume of people coming in looking for work, which meant that the slums of Glasgow that were inhabited by the working class became overpopulated by poor, unemployed families. The problem of overcrowding strikes again. This was an environment where Glasgow gang culture was born and birthed the likes of the penny gangs. Crime rates were going through the roof. But it wasn't just the shipyards that were unable to cope with the demand. Calton Jail, Glasgow Toll Booth, North Street Prison and Duke Street Prison were the go-to jails for criminals in Glasgow. They were all over the city and they served different functions, housing debtors, petty offenders, and more serious criminals awaiting trial or transportation. But these were only built to accommodate a smaller population for a period in history. Not to mention that the conditions were insanitary, to say the least, and most of them unfit for purpose. The thing is, during this period, prisons were run by local councils, who were usually made up of landowners and merchants, essentially people with money. Due to the fact that councils operated the jails, they were responsible for funding, construction, maintenance, staffing and policy formation. The funding came from local taxes, so depending on the economic prosperity of the area, that would massively affect prison conditions. Let's just say a jail in Mulgai was much better than a jail in Govan. This meant there was a lot of inconsistencies throughout the country in regards to the prison system. Basically, it was in utter shambles, with the overcrowding problem putting a massive strain on an already fractured system. The Home Office decided to get in about it and would implement the Prison Scotland Act of 1877. The Act transferred the responsibility for maintaining prisons for local authorities to the Home Secretary. That was a man called Richard Ashton Cross, who happened to be a Tory. No surprise there. So this meant rather than multiple councils running separate jails with different rules and funding, it would be a case of one singer, one song. This would revolutionise the Scottish prison system. One of the first ports of call was establishing the Prison Commissioners for Scotland, who was responsible for overseeing the administration, operation and regulation of prisons in Scotland. Their main function was to assist the Home Secretary, and they pretty much replaced the local councils in the management of the prison system. It's fair to say they had their work cut out for them. The population was at an all-time high, crime rates were through the roof, and suddenly they had to come up with a solution that solved multiple problems at once. This led to them making the decision to open up a new national prison for Scotland, one which would solder itself into our country's dark history. And it also played a part in my own personal history. This prison was HMP Barlinnie. Barlinnie was designed by Major General Thomas Bernard Collins, architect and engineer to the Scottish Prison Department. Built in the northeast of Glasgow and Ridley, the grounds were bought in 1879 and construction started in 1880. The first prisoners would arrive in Addiewell on the 15th of August 1882. At this stage, Addiewell was the only cell block that was built. So, in order to keep construction costs down, prisoners for Addiewell were used as labourers to help build B, C and D Hall, which were constructed between 1883 and 1892. Then in 1896, the infamous E Hall would be added to help with, can you guess it, overcrowding. Barlinnie adopted Perth's model of prisoner separation based on age, gender and severity of crime. Plus it took advantage of the larger prison population by introducing manual labour that would accommodate larger groups of prisoners. This would take the form of prison construction, as I mentioned previously, but also beating rocks for the local quarry. Just battering boulders all day. As much as Barlinnie had made advances in attempting to rehabilitate prisoners by introducing constructive work programmes, its punitive measures were still very much in the dark ages. For instance, a common punishment back then for unruly behaviour was to get wrapped up in a straitjacket and your horns cuffed behind your back overnight. Depending on the severity of your punishment, it could extend to more than one night, right? But of course, the prison did take precautions. They would assess if the con was fit for this punishment by the prison, and the warden would put on the cuffs and the jacket. And there was me thinking that all humanity was lost. At least they had the decency to make sure you could hack it before they grabbed the jacket. Come on, somebody's got to be laughing. But funnily enough, it would be a jacket and exploitation of prisoner labour that would land Barlinnie in one of its many controversies in 1943, when a prisoner called Leonard Wilson and 4 other cons were given unsupervised painting work in the Governor's house. Let me explain this. See, back then, the Governor's house would be very similar to a janitor's house in a school. This would be the acting Governor's personal residence, located just in or about the prison grounds. This was during a time where there was no such thing as instant communication like phones or radios, so the Governor had to be reachable in case of emergencies. Leonard Wilson was a 23-year-old former soldier for London who was serving a sentence for a housebreaking. It decided to seize the opportunity whilst being in the Governor's house to swipe a jacket, a pair of trousers and a watch. And listen, His plan wasn't to take them back up the hall and swap it for a bit of spice. You know what I'm talking about? These were much simpler times. And Leonard Wilson's plan was to get the boot done. Pulling on the governor's favourite clobber, Leonard Wilson walked off and nobody batted an eyelid. But the thing is, the governor's clays must have been a bit too wee for him, because the next day he broke into a house in St George's Road in Glasgow and robbed a full wardrobe. Apparently he found a boyfriend. His freedom would be short-lived when an off-duty copper spotted him in a tram car, recognising him for the mugshots since he was wanted, and jailed him. In court, Wilson would receive an extra 3-month imprisonment. A ballsy escape indeed, but it had not known what would be Barlinnie's first major jailbreak in 1980, when Johnny Boy Steele, his brother Jim, and a man called Archie escaped in a very audacious fashion. Johnny Boy and Jim were classed as high-risk prisoners due to a previous jail escape in another jail, so they were unable to be housed in the top landing in case they escaped, or the bottom landing in case they tunnelled out. So they both stayed in the second landing, whilst Archie was on the third. But what Johnny discovered was a 12-inch wide shaft filled with pipes that linked to the top flare. So using this shaft, Johnny Boy and Jim managed to climb to the third flare to join Archie. And from there, they managed to access a space between the ceiling and the roof, where the metal gate had already been partially cut by another con using a smuggled hacksaw. The three of them climbed until eventually reaching a door which led onto the roof. From there, they were able to see a number of accomplices that were also on the other side of the prison wall who were waiting to aid them in their escape. The accomplices went into the staff quarters garden and tied one end of the mountaineering rope to a washing line pole. Johnny Boy threw down a reel of tape he stole from the textile workshop, and the rope was attached to it so he could pull it back and tie it in the other end. With the rope now set in place at both ends, the trio abseiled down to the walls of the prison into the back of a getaway vehicle where they made their escape. But unfortunately for the boys, they were caught within a few weeks and returned to the jail. Side note, if you want to hear the story of the jailbreak along with many other prison escape stories, then check out my podcast with the man himself, Johnny Boy Steele, only on Premeditated Patter. But back to the episode. There was also another occasion in 1985 when a man called John Dobby, 3 days into a 15-year sentence, would hide inside a laundry van and escape from Barlinnie. He was on the run for 5 days before being eventually caught and then sentenced to another 5 years in jail. You can't help but notice there was a pattern emerging here, right? What was causing prisoners to try and escape in the 1980s? Was it the inability to deal with the loss of freedom? Were they choking for their hole? Or was it the grub? You see, it might have been all of these things. It might have been all of these factors. But one of the biggest issues during that period in time was prison violence. And not just con-on-con action. This was brutality at the hands of the screws. In one incident in particular, where convicted robber Sammy the Bear Ralston was allegedly beaten by the wardens with sticks whilst he'd been gagged to muffle his screams. For the cons in B-Hall, this was a step too far. A decision that would spark the most infamous rebellion Barlinnie had seen to date. And that was the 1987 Barlinnie riots. On January 5th, 1987, around 7:30 PM in B-Hall, a number of cons got tooled up with makeshift weapons and wore pillowcases as balaclavas. They overpowered the screws. Lockers, beds and debris were flung from the landings to the bottom flat. Fires were lit and the cons took control. There was roughly 41 screws in the hall when the riot broke out, but most of them managed to get away. But 5 of them would barricade themselves inside a cell in the third flat trying to escape for the carnage. Although this was a decision that would be a massive mistake. You see, it wouldn't take long before the cons realised the screws were in the cells, eventually gaining access and capturing them. Of the 5 screws, 2 would be released and 3 were taken hostage. It was only a matter of time before the cons would gain access to the roof, where they would start throwing concrete slabs and tiles onto the street below. By this point, the SPS had declared the riot a major prison disturbance, which called for assistance for the SPS and the police. Within a few hours, it was declared a major prison disturbance, mobilising resources for the Scottish Prison Service and local authorities. Senior officials, including Governor Andrew Gallagher, coordinated with law enforcement to assess the situation and strategise a response. With B-Hall being under the cons' command, they would eventually get access to the roof, where they appeared and started ripping slates for the roof and launching them onto the street below, causing it January 5th, 1987, the night Barlinnie turned into a war zone. It's just after 7:30 in B-Hall, the kind of time folks should be settling down. But no, not in the big house. Inside there was, a storm was brewing. A squad of cons, face covered in pillowcases like makeshift balaclavas, got tooled up with sharpened metal, chair legs, and anything else they could get their hands on. This wasn't just mayhem, it was mutiny. Beds and lockers hurled off landings, missiles, fires flickering up, and the very bones of the prison shook. Screws ran for their lives. Most of them escaped, but no all. 5 screws found themselves trapped and barricaded in a cell on the 3rd landing, trying to hide from the madness. But that move was a colossal mistake. The cons clocked it quickly. They kicked in the door, 2 screws got released, but other 3 get kept as hostages. And then it escalated. The cons smashed their way into the roof. They started launching slates and concrete slabs down to the street below. The SPS went into full panic. The riot was declared a major disturbance. Backup drafted in from across the country. Governor Andrew Gallagher tried to hold it together and coordinate with the police. But B-Hall wasn't his anymore. It was the cons. And this is a bit people forget. This wasn't the first time. You see, back in 1986, just months before, 40 cons had staged another siege. This one lasted 4 days and ended in flames, causing £500,000 in damage. That time, a screw got taken hostage as well. John Renton for the Prisoners Association blamed overcrowding and understaffing, but the politicians denied it. Malcolm Rifkind, the State Secretary at the time, brushed it off, said only 50 out of 5,000 prisoners were involved. As if that meant it wasn't serious. Ian Lang, Home Affairs Minister, came out spinning. He claimed Barlinnie wasn't overcrowded and rehabilitation was the focus. But you ask any con in that cage what they were getting, and they'll tell you slop buckets, cracked walls, brutality, and broken promises. Eventually, after 18 hours of siege, the riot fizzled out. The turning point, negotiators managed to talk the remaining cons down. Promises were dangled, and slowly the hostages were released, battered but alive. The last of the rooftop warriors surrendered at dawn. No bullets, no SAS, just exhaustion, cold, and no way out. And just like that, the dust settled. But the cracks were shown. You see, this riot wasn't just about one grievance. It was a scream against a system that had been creaking for decades. Overcrowded cells, overstretched staff, and no real focus on rehabilitation. Just containment. And aye, Barlinnie did come back under control, but the system was still teetering. Barlinnie saw its host with problematic prisoners, but there was always that 1% that the system itself couldn't handle, spread throughout the jail system, wreaking carnage wherever they went. But it was in the 1970s where a revolutionary idea would become one of the most progressive measures in the Scottish prison system to this date, and that idea was the special unit. So it's the early 1970s, right? The Scottish prison system was bursting at the seams with violence. Prisoners slashing each other, screws getting attacked left, right and centre. It was just chaos, right? The traditional punishments like battering cons into submission just made things worse, surprisingly. So the SPS realised something needed to change sharpish. They looked down south to England, to a place called HMP Grendon. You see, Grendon wasn't your normal nick. It was based on this mad idea called a therapeutic community, basically meaning prisoners and guards work together to deal with the root causes of violence instead of just punishing the surface behaviour. Initially, they planned to build this unit in Perth, but logistics meant it ended up in Glasgow's infamous Barlinnie in 1973, in an old block that used to house female prisoners. And that was it. The special unit was born. Now, the special unit wasn't your usual prison setup. Here's the deal, right? Cons were treated as actual human beings. Mental, right? They go to wear their own clobber, no prison garb. There was no shouting matches or batterings for screws. Instead, cons and screws talked things out. They made decisions together. Respect was earned and given both ways. And here's where it get really interesting, right? The inmates got to explore their creativity. These are guys that are previously known for stabbing and slashing, were now picking up paintbrushes and chisels. An art therapist called Joyce Lang, a legendary woman, got involved and helped inmates channel their rage and pain into art and writing. One famous inmate, you might have heard of him, Jimmy Boyle, was one of the hardest guys in Scotland, but he went from being a notorious gangster to a successful artist and writer. Jimmy Boyle was the poster boy for what the special unit could do. And right, before we go any further, right, let's get a wee bit of background on Jimmy Boyle, because you can't really talk about the special unit without giving him a mention. See, Jimmy Boyle wasn't just some petty criminal, right? He was known across Glasgow as one of Scotland's most dangerous criminals. Born and raised in the Gorbals, he grew up in a world of poverty and violence. But in the 1960s, he was a leading figure in Glasgow's underworld, infamous for his ruthless violence and gang involvement. Boyle was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment for murder in 1967. But even behind bars, he was a nightmare to manage. He fought guards, stabbed fellow prisoners, started riots, and spent long periods in solitary confinement. He was considered one of Scotland's most violent and disruptive inmates. Somebody the system just couldn't handle. Eventually, Boyle was transferred to the newly opened special unit in Barlinnie in 1973, in what was basically a desperate attempt to manage him. And incredibly, this was the turning point for Boyle. Introduced to art therapy, he channeled his aggression into creativity, becoming an accomplished sculptor and writer. His autobiography, A Sense of Freedom, even inspired a famous film starring Scottish actor David Heyman, which showed the power of rehabilitation firsthand. But listen, we can't deny it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, right? Ere its 21 years operating, there was 11 serious incidents. But here's the thing, right? Only 2 were actual assaults. Most of them were just guys barricading themselves in the cell when emotions got too much. But you think about that, right? Some of Scotland's most dangerous men, and only 2 assaults in their 20 year. And listen, the 2 assaults were serious, but isolated. In one of the incidents, a con attacked another con during a dispute, resulting in injuries but no fatalities. The second assault was between a con and a screw essentially. Again, it was serious, but it was quickly resolved without further escalation. What's important to highlight here, right, is these incidents of violence were exceptions rather than the norm. Far fewer than standard prison halls at the time. And the unit wasn't just effective at stopping violence inside, right? It was actually helping these guys stay out of trouble when they got out. You see, of the 36 guys that went through the special unit, only 4 get reconvicted. That is mental, considering the history of violence these guys had. Like pure unheard of success. But we can't talk about incidents in the special unit without discussing one of its most notorious events, which was the death of Larry Winters. Winters was another high-profile inmate sentenced to life imprisonment in 1964 for murder. Like Jimmy Boyle, Winters was violent and unmanageable in regular jails, and he eventually ended up in a special unit and all. Larry Winters was a complicated figure, intelligent but tormented. He struggled with drug dependency and mental health issues. But inside the special unit, he began to show progress, engaging with therapy, poetry and creative writing. But unfortunately, his struggles with drugs never completely went away. In September 1977, Larry Winters died of a drug overdose inside the special unit. His death was a massive scandal at the time. Media jumped all over it, claiming it was proof that the special unit wasn't working. His life was actually so impactful, it actually inspired a Scottish film called Silent Scream, which looked at Winters' tragic journey and questioned the prison system itself. Winters' death highlighted both the promise and the harsh realities of the therapeutic approach. It was groundbreaking, but no perfect. As you can imagine, not everybody was happy with all this. Some people in the public were raging. They thought it was soft. These guys are violent criminals. What you playing at, giving them art lessons? Papers like the Daily Record loved stirring it up to sell copies. Every time something minor went down, they splashed it across the front pages, shouting about scandal. Politicians were split. Some thought it was a progressive approach to rehabilitation. Others saw it as a total waste of taxpayers' money. Bit of a cheat to talk, if you ask me. Airtime pressure mounted and the political mood shifted back to being tough on crime. Things weren't looking good for the special unit. In 1994, after 21 years, the special unit shut down for good. Why? It was expensive to run, staff intensive, and politicians and public opinion swung back to a more traditional approach to punishment. The authorities started to lose faith, no matter how well it worked. In the end, the revolutionary idea of treating criminals as human beings was considered too controversial, too radical, and frankly, too expensive. So here's a £1 million question, right? Did it work? You could argue both ways, right? The special unit drastically reduced violence and recidivism among Scotland's most dangerous prisoners, but society just wasn't ready for it. David Wilson, a leading criminologist, described it brilliantly, right? He called it a quote-unquote failed success. It proved rehabilitation could work, but the system itself wasn't ready for it. The unit's closure left a bitter taste, and it took the Scottish prison system back to square one. Punishment first, rehabilitation second. To this day, there's not been another like it in Scotland. But the special unit's short existence proved one thing clearly. If you give people respect, compassion, and opportunities to change, many actually will. After the special unit was closed, Barlinnie was still operating under conditions that weren't exactly up to scratch. Reports started to pile up, criticising the place for being insanitary and outdated. I know you probably remember hearing about the grim practice of slotting out, where cons had to use buckets as toilets in their cell. It actually took until the late 90s to properly address this. And between 1997 and 2004, Barlinnie went through some serious renovations. Finally, they get toilets installed in cells, improving human rights conditions massively, at least on paper. But did this solve all the problems? No, really. Even after these improvements, Barlinnie was still bursting at the seams. Built to hold around 1,000 prisoners, Barlinnie usually holds about 1,400 cons, right? Running constantly at about 140% of its capacity. Overcrowding meant rehabilitation programmes suffered, conditions deteriorated again, and violence was always just under the surface. It became obvious to everybody that simply renovating wasn't enough. Barlinnie was struggling to cope. Eventually the Scottish Government realised there wasn't much more they could do with the building. In January 2020, they announced plans to build a completely new facility called HMP Glasgow. It meant to replace the ageing Barlinnie entirely. They picked the former site of gasworks in Cornton Vale in the northeast of the city for this massive new super jail. It's supposed to be a state-of-the-art facility that could hold up to 1,344 cons and improve much improved conditions. But here's the thing. As of now, the new HMP Glasgow has been bogged down in delays and skyrocketing costs. What started out as a £100 million project is ballooned to nearly £1 billion, and completion is not expected until at least 2028. That's nearly a decade after it was announced. It just goes to show that even with good intentions, the system is still fraught with complications and delays. And an interesting twist for all this, right? Recently there's been moves to recognise the historical importance of Barlinnie itself. Historic Environment Scotland launched a consultation in October 2024 proposing to give the prison category A-listed status, meaning it would be preserved for historical and architectural reasons. So imagine that, right? A building that's been a symbol of punishment and incarceration for over 100 years being protected as a historical monument. It just shows you the complicated legacy behind places like Barlinnie. Places that symbolise hardship, violence, but also Scotland's unique social history. But Barlinnie isn't the only infamous jail in Scotland's history. There was also another establishment that made its mark and carved out a notorious reputation of its own. Known by some as Scotland's Alcatraz, located in the northeast, its brutal regime welcomes some of Scotland's most violent cons. Next up is HMP Peterhead. Peterhead Prison opened its gates way back in 1888. What a sherlock! Right in the bleak coast of Aberdeenshire. It was deliberately built to be a high security facility, specifically designed to hold long-term and dangerous inmates for all over Scotland. To put it bluntly, right, this was the place to send folk when they wanted to lock them up and throw away the key. The location wasn't by accident. It was remote, isolated, and miles from anywhere decent. They believed the harsh environment and distance would make it impossible for any escape attempts to succeed. which led to the description of Scotland's Alcatraz. No exaggeration there. When they built Peterhead, they didn't mess about. The prison was constructed using solid granite quarried for the local area, making the walls thick, impenetrable and grim. The cells were small and cramped, with barely enough room to move about. Cons had no comforts whatsoever. No electricity, no proper heating, no modern sanitation. They used buckets for toilets, and life was as miserable as you can imagine. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about physically breaking them down to stop them from causing trouble. The screws ruled with an iron fist, and any sign of disobedience was swiftly met with harsh punishments like solitary confinement, reduced rations, or even brutal beatings. You see, every single part of Peterhead was designed to control and intimidate inmates into submission. Its nickname as Scotland's Alcatraz was well earned. It wasn't just a prison, it was a fortress, specifically built to break the hardest men Scotland could throw at it. But in October 1972, tensions at Peterhead boiled there into a massive rooftop protest. Sick to the back teeth of being treated like animals, cons made their way up to the rooftops, shouting and waving banners demanding basic human rights. Conditions inside were brutal. Cells were overcrowded, sanitation was dire, and food wasn't fit for human consumption. And cons just had enough. What was supposed to be a high security fortress now had cons openly protesting for decent treatment and dignity, right in full view of the full world. But the protests in 72 were just the start. See, conditions never really improved, and resentment inside kept growing. By 1976, Peterhead was a pressure cooker, ready to explode again, and explode it did. Inmates started smashing up their cells, ripping apart furniture, and barricading themselves inside. These protests dragged on for days, with prisoners refusing to back down until they were taken seriously. Then in 1977, things got even more intense. Once again, prisoners made it to the rooftops, this time staying up there for even longer, shouting their demands and drawing attention for the media and the public. You see, these riots were more about than just basic comforts. They were a desperate cry for reform. An embarrassment to the Scottish authorities, forced them to finally acknowledge that something had to change. Peterhead was suddenly making headlines for all the wrong reasons, exposing to the public just how brutal life really was inside Scotland's toughest jail. These protests became a catalyst for conversations about human rights, reform, and how Scotland was treating its prisoners. But this was nothing in comparison to October 1987, when one riot escalated to such a serious point that the Scottish Government had no choice but to call in the SAS. This was a full-blown siege, and it changed Scotland's prison history forever. What set this riot apart wasn't just the scale, it was how quickly and violently things escalated. It all started when cons, fed up at the point of no return, took control of a whole section of the jail, specifically D Hall. But this time they weren't just protesting. They barricaded doors, smashed furniture to pieces, and took a screw hostage. Suddenly, it wasn't just about bad conditions or protesting for rights. This was a life or death standoff. You see, the cons had learned from earlier riots. They knew shouting on rooftops hadn't forced enough change, and now they had to up the stakes. With a screw's life in the line, the authorities were backed into a corner. The screws tried negotiating, but the cons weren't budging. After days of a stalemate and tensions rising, the Scottish Government panicked. They realised the situation was far beyond their control. For the first time ever on mainland Britain, the government had no choice but to call in the Special Air Service, the SAS, an elite military force usually reserved for dealing with terrorists and hostage situations abroad. Just imagine that. The hardest men in Scotland's jail being confronted by Britain's most lethal Special Forces unit. When the SAS stormed Peterhead, they did it fast and hard, using stun grenades and rapid tactics to overwhelm the cons and end the siege. Ended with no fatalities, but the controversy was massive. Scotland was stunned that it came to this, using soldiers to solve a prison riot. What made this different was how it forced the public, the government and the whole justice system to confront the reality of prison conditions, violence and human rights. After 1987, Peterhead wasn't just tough, it was legendary for all the wrong reasons. This was the moment that SPS got its arse kicked into reality. See, up until then they'd been trying to keep order with outdated methods, brute force, solitary humiliation, but the siege showed the world that the system wasn't just broken, it was dangerous, volatile and totally unsuitable. Here's the thing, see when you need to send the SAS into a prison, you know something's gone far beyond the usual screws, losing control patter. The fact that trained counter-terrorist soldiers had to be called in to deal with Scottish cons, that's not just bad press, that is an international embarrassment. See, this exposed the real cracks in the system. Prisoners were being warehoused, brutalised and forgotten. There was no proper rehab, no mental health support, no strategy to stop people from coming back through the gates. So when these cons snapped and took a screw hostage, it wasn't just thuggery, it was the inevitable result of decades of neglect. And the way the 1987 siege put the fear into the establishment, they realised you can't just bottle up trauma, rage and desperation forever. It'll explode. And Peterhead's explosion shook the entire system. That moment is why prison reform in Scotland had to shift gears. Now they knew what the consequences of ignorance really looked like. Straight after the siege, the Scottish Prison Service came under heavy fire. You had human rights groups shouting about torture-like conditions, journalists digging up horror stories for ex-cons, and even staff inside Peterhead quietly admitting it was pure chaos behind the scenes. Investigations were launched, papers started printing phrases like barbaric and institutional violence to describe Peterhead. Even the screws were burnt out, staff morale was in the gutter, recruitment was a nightmare, and the turnover rate was sky high. The place had become a pressure cooker for both sides of the bars. Everybody knew it. Peterhead was beyond repair. But despite all this, the jail stayed open. The big house must stay open. The fundamental issue remained. Peterhead was built in the Victorian era for a Victorian-style punishment system. No matter how many layers you painted at it, the bones of the place were still 19th century. By the early 90s, the SPS turned it into a specialist nick for male sex offenders. The idea was to separate these cons from the general population, to prevent them getting a down for their inmates, as sex offenders are typically seen as the lowest of the low inside. You wouldn't be surprised to know that. They also plan to provide targeted rehabilitation programmes like the sex offender treatment programme called STOP, which started in 1993. The goal was to make these offenders confront their crimes and reduce the chances of them reoffending upon release. Peterhead soon earned the nickname Monsters Mansion, an eerie badge which reflected the horrors inside its walls. By the 2000s, it wasn't just a high security nick, it was the place Scotland locked up the darkest, most disturbed predators in the country. You had people like Robert Black, a serial killer and paedophile responsible for the abduction, sexual assault and murder of at least 4 young women across the UK in the 80s. Then you had Peter Tobin, another killer linked to the deaths of Angelica Clark, Vicky Hamilton and Dina McNichol, and widely believed to be a notorious Barlinnie serial killer, Bible John. And let's not forget William Beggs, the so-called limbs in the lock killer, and butchered 18-year-old Barry Wallace, dismembered him and dumped his remains across Scotland. These weren't just sex offenders, they were monsters, they were Cadbury's feasts, and Peterhead was where Scotland kept them chained. Plus, the community of Peterhead wasn't exactly chuffed about their town being synonymous with housing the nation's sex offenders. And honestly, who could blame them? Imagine trying to raise a wane, run a business, or build a sense of pride in your local area when everybody in Scotland hears Peterhead and instantly thinks, pedo, or monsters. That's not exactly good PR, is it? See, it created a kind of double life for the place. In one hand, we had a historic coastal town steeped in fishing traditions with honest, hard-working folk. And the other, it was a site of a prison filled with Scotland's most hated criminals. And the media didn't help either. Every time a new sicko was convicted, the headline screamed, locked up in Peterhead, like it was some badge of shame for the entire community. You had locals constantly defending their town to outsiders, saying, aye, the jail's here, but we'll know that. But the damage was done. Tourism was non-existent, investment was slow, and some people even say the property values took a hit. The stigma ran deep, and it stuck. For a long time, Peterhead was known for two things: fishing and sex offenders. But it wasn't just its reputation that was crumbling. You see, by the early 2000s, Peterhead prison was literally falling apart at the seams. Built in 1888, it was a Victorian dinosaur still trying to operate in a modern world. You still had inmates using chemical toilets because there was no proper plumbing. They'd do their business in a bucket-like toilet filled with blue disinfectant liquid. These were only emptied like twice a week, meaning the smell, hygiene and dignity levels were basically in the gutter. If you're locked in your cell for tea time till breakfast, you were stuck with the stink the whole night. Oh, nothing worse than a sex offender's shite, know what I'm talking about? There was no proper access to healthcare, overcrowded wings and outdated security systems. Staff morale was in the gutter, and reports like the one for the prison inspectorate in 2006 painted a brutal picture. Cons locked up for 14 hours with their own waste, limited rehabilitation and poor preparation for release. The place was no longer just tough, it was an embarrassment, and the Scottish Government knew it. The SPS knew it. Even the staff were saying, we can't run a modern prison in a building that's literally crumbling. So in 2011, the final decision came down. Peterhead would shut its doors. So after decades of riots, brutality, and Scotland's hardest criminals being locked behind Peterhead's granite walls, the place had finally ran its course. It was outdated, inhumane, and literally crumbling at the seams. And whilst the 1987 SAS siege might have been the final straw in the public eye, the deeper truth was Peterhead had become a symbol of everything broken in the system. But then something interesting happened. Instead of knocking the place down, people started asking, what if we preserved it? What if we kept it? You see, despite the horrors, Peterhead Jail had become part of Scottish history. A place where riots kicked off, where the SAS stormed the halls, where some of the country's darkest criminals lived and died. Locals, historians, and even former jail staff backed the idea. They thought, if we're going to be known for the jail, then we might as well own the story. Tell it on our own terms. And that's how the idea for the Peterhead Prison Museum came about. It wasn't just about showing cells and hanging up uniforms. It was about telling the real story. The violence, the brutality, the riots, the mistakes, but also the reform, the resistance, and the resilience of its inhabitants. The museum opened its gates to the public in June 2016, just a few years after the jail shut. And believe it or not, it's been a success. Thousands of visitors walk through the corridors every year, hearing stories from former screws, standing in the cells that once held Scotland's most feared men, and learning how this wee coastal town carried the burden of the country's criminal past. But here's the thing, Peterhead wasn't the only jail for the North East that ended up condemned, because just 30 miles down the road sat another institution, lesser known to outsiders, but just as significant in the history books, HMP Craiginches, or as the locals called it, the Aberdeen Jail. Craiginches opened its gates in 1890, right in the Tory area of Aberdeen, built to deal with the growing population of the Granite City. It served as the main remand and short-term sentence jail for the North East. Unlike Peterhead, which held long-term high-risk prisoners, Craiginches was a revolving door, people in for thefts, assaults, missed fines and bail breaches. A sheepshagger's Barlinnie. It was the kind of place every troublemaker for Aberdeen, Fraserburgh, Stonehaven or even the Highlands passed through at least once. If you were lifted in the North East, chances are you ended up in Craiginches before you'd even sobered up. But make no mistake about it, it wasn't such a walk in the park. Craiginches had its own dark history. Overcrowding was chronic, the regime was rigid, and like Peterhead, the building itself was a Victorian relic. Inmates were locked up for long periods with limited activities, and mental health support was almost non-existent. You probably realise by now, right, that this is pretty much the theme of the Scottish prison system. But we continue. Early years, Craiginches became a symbol of short-termers. It wasn't just about rehab, it was about containing people. Even the screws said it was bursting at the seams. Reports in the early 2000s showed it was regularly air capacity, with cells designed for one con now holding about 2 or 3. And here's a wee grim bit of trivia, right? Craiginches was the site of the last execution in Scotland. On the 15th of August 1963, Henry John Burnett was hung for the murder of his missus' new partner. He was 21 when he was hung, and his case became the final execution in Scottish history before capital punishment was effectively abolished in the UK in 1965 and bracket F, formally removed in 1998. That's right, it became the final man to face capital punishment north of the border, right there in Aberdeen. It was the final chapter in the age of state-sanctioned death and a chilling moment in the history of Scottish justice. By the early 2010s, it was clear to everybody Craiginches couldn't go on. Building was falling apart, resources were stretched, and the regime was out of touch. The SPS needed a new solution, something that could handle the complex needs of modern prisoners, including women, YOs, remand cases, and short-termers. But before we go any further, right, there's still one more prison in the north of the country which has etched its name into Scottish prison history. Human rights breaches were commonplace. Horrific isolation was the regime. A prison built to separate man from spirit, which would eventually culminate in a riot which would change the prison system forever. Located in Inverness, the prison authority knew it as HMP Porterfield, but the cons knew it as the cages. HMP Inverness first opened its doors in 1902, built to serve the Highlands and Islands region, a vast swathe of land with sparse population, but the rest of the country is still needing a place to house people that strayed from the right path. On the surface it looked like a typical small town jail, but behind the sandstone walls, something far more sinister was cooking up. You see, Inverness was never meant to be a big nick. It was built to house local offenders, people lifted for petty crime, thefts, assaults, and sometimes people awaiting transfer. But as the 20th century rolled on, it developed a reputation as a place you really didn't want to end up in, especially if you were labelled a problem by the system. Between 1966 and 1972, a new regime began to operate in Inverness, an experimental and brutal segregation area that came to be known by cons and screws alike as the cages. This wasn't a nickname that needed much imagination. These cells were 9 foot by 6 foot, barely big enough to do a slop it. Inside there was no personal items except a plastic chamber pot, a single book, a wool blanket, and no lid in the toilet. That's your luxury package, right there. Prisoners were held in complete solitary confinement, sometimes for up to a year at a time. They were locked up 23 hours a day, with the only human contact being brutal full body searches by screws who checked their mouth, armpits, their arsehole, and feet 3 times a day, even if they'd never left the cell. One source said there is no communication between the screws and the prisoner. He is alone and at the complete mercy of the screws, who took full advantage of his helplessness. If you were quote unquote awkward, they'd leave your food just out of reach behind the bars, cold, covered in spit. And that's how they broke people. This wasn't just a jail, it was psychological torture dressed up as punishment. A control unit, before we even knew what that meant. This place got its nickname for the outdoor exercise yards, and I use that term lightly, right? They weren't yards, they were metal wire pens bolted onto the rooftops. So imagine it, right? Cages in the sky. That's the kind of thing you'd see keeping wildlife in a zoo. Only instead of animals, it was broken men. And that's how cons get their daily dose of fresh air. Locked inside wire mesh like rabid dogs. The screws never had to step outside. The cons paced up and down like they were losing the nut, because guess what? They were! But this systematic torture wasn't to last forever, because it would eventually result in a riot. But not just any riot. It was a riot that would change the Scottish prison system forever. Let's go back to 1972. Now here's where things kicked off, right? In 1972, years of pent-up frustration and rage boiled there. It started with frustration, lack of mental health support, constant isolation, a regime that was pure psychological warfare. But one day, the cons had enough. Fires were lit, cells were wrecked, and the cons launched a full-blown riot right there in the cages. This wasn't just a strop, this was an organised insurrection. Cons used bed frames, metal rods, anything they could get their hands on. They smashed lights, barricaded doors, and screamed at the Highland skies, demanding change. The screws, outnumbered, undertrained, couldn't do much. The whole thing turned into a siege. It was a turning point. The riot lasted hours. Some people said that guards had to retreat and wait for backup to enter. Windows get shattered and walls get set alight. Prisoners were eventually subdued, but no before sending a clear message. The system was brewing a mental health crisis, and it was about to explode in every jail across the country. All in all, a few cons and a few screws get severely injured, and 4 cons got additional sentences for up to 6 years for assaulting prison staff. But here's where things took a turn, right? See, that riot in 1972 wasn't just a blowout, it was a wake-up call to the whole system. It rattled the SPS to its bones. The brutality in the cages, the psychological torture, the complete collapse in control. It showed the authority that trying to crush violence with even more violence wasn't working. The cons in Inverness were cracking up, lashing out, and ending up worse than when they came in. So the powers that be, in a rare moment of self-awareness, decided something had to change. And that's when the idea started floating. What if instead of punishing the hardest cases, we try understanding them? That seed eventually grew into the Barlinnie Special Unit, which opened just a year later in 1973. So in a way, the fires that lit up the roof of Inverness were the same ones that sparked a revolution in Scottish prison rehabilitation. Fast forward to the modern day, and HMP Inverness is still hanging in there. The place is ancient, it's over 120-year-old, and the 2022 full inspection report by the HM Inspectorate of Prisons made it clear. This jail is way past its expiry date, but they did give credit where it was due. Staff relationships with prisoners were actually no bad. A lot of the cons said they felt treated with respect. Mental health support, addiction services, family contact, all got a decent mention. That says a lot about the people working there, trying their best under pressure. But here's the catch. The place is bursting at the seams. It's built to hold about 110 cons, but it's often sitting well above that. There's no space for expansion, no proper facilities for rehab, and no chance of running full-time education or work parties when you've got people double bunking in tiny Victorian cells. Inspectors said it straight. The prison estate is no fit for purpose. Are you beginning to see a pattern here? And to make things worse, a jail's supposed to hold all sorts. Men, women, remand prisoners, short-termers, long-termers. But you've only got the one spot with no way to separate them completely. That creates all sorts of tension, disruption, and limits proper rehabilitation. That's why the SPS has been pushing for HMP Highland, a new modern facility to replace Inverness entirely, a place with actual space, modern design, and the ability to run proper programmes for day one. It's been years in the making, but as it stands, HMP Highland is expected to open in 2026, and no before time. But before HMP Highland could be opened, the prison system desperately needed somewhere to warehouse all the sheepshaggers since the closure of Craiginches and Peterhead. They had an idea, right? And that consisted of better conditions, better programmes, and a better legacy. Idea being the dominant word here. The SPS planned to introduce a modern facility up north in 2014 that would serve the public in the prison system. But it would also be a blueprint for a new approach. This blueprint was HMP Grampian. Plans for Grampian first hit the public domain in the late 2000s. The SPS formally announced their intention to build a replacement for both HMP Peterhead and HMP Aberdeen around 2009. The goal was to close 2 old, deteriorating jails and replace them with one state-of-the-art facility that would serve the entire northeast. Construction kicked off in the site of the old Peterhead prison in 2012, and the brand new HMP and YOI Grampian officially opened its doors in March 2014. But what was different about Grampian? First off, it was billed as Scotland's first community-facing prison. That means it was designed to not just hold people, but to rehabilitate them properly. and to keep them connected to their families and communities. It's not a mega jail, by the way. It was built to hold around 500 to 560 cons split across several units. You had Elan Hall, which was for adult prisoners. You had Banff Hall for the female prisoners. You had Cruden Hall for the young YOs. We'll come back to that one. And Aberlour Hall for community access and prep for release. And Dice Hall, which was the segregation wing. But unlike Peterhead, where people were locked in 23 hours a day with chemical crappers, Grampian boasts modern cells, ensuite toilets, training rooms, education spaces, healthcare wings, and a strong focus on through care, meaning help with housing, jobs, and addiction when cons get out. Staff get newer training. The vibe was supposed to be more supportive, therapeutic, less lock you up and throw away the key, and more let's try fix you. About time I know. That was until the Cruden Hall riot. So here's the thing with Cruden Hall, right? That was a wing in Grampian that they built specifically for young offenders. Try to give them a fresh, rehabilitative setup with more structure and opportunity, right? But only a few months after the jail opened in 2014, it kicked off. There was a serious incident, right? Fighting, smashing up cells, total carnage, right? The YOs basically tore the place to bits. The screws couldn't contain it. It was that bad that they shut the whole hall down and shift the YOs elsewhere. Now, you might think, surely it's back open by now. No, it's stayed shut for years. Not because it's a bad hall, funnily enough. In fact, inspectors said it's one of the best built wings in the country, but the staffing levels just weren't there. They didn't have the numbers to safely run it. Even with jails bursting at the seams across the country, Cruden Hall sat empty. That's how mad things go. Cells lying empty whilst other halls are rammed 2 or 3 to a room. Now to be fair, they've just started using part of it again as of late 2024, trying to ease the overcrowding, but it's still not running at full tilt. It's all hinging on staffing. No screws, no operations. Simple as that. The whole thing tells you a lot, right? You can build the fanciest jail in the world, but if you can't staff it properly, it's just concrete and chaos. Right for the off, right? They struggled to keep enough screws in the building. You had people transferred for the old jail plus brand new recruits, and they all came in with different ways of doing things. It was like throwing 3 jigsaws in a bag and expecting a masterpiece. And remember, this wasn't a normal nick. They were trying to run men, women and YOs all under the same roof. That's 3 very different populations with different needs, routines and problems. And they just didn't have the bodies to manage it. So instead of getting tailored regimes and proper support, cons ended up stuck in their cells, sitting in limbo, because there wasn't enough staff to open them up or get activities going. Understaffed, overcrowded, overpromised, and underdelivered. A long-running story repeated throughout the prison system. We've heard enough of the old school, right? But what about the new school? Next up, we're going to a place that held some of the most dangerous young men and eventually women in the country. This is the story of HMYOI Polmont. Before Polmont became the big house for young YOs, it was actually something dead posh. The place used to be called Blair Lodge Academy, a fancy wee boarding school built in 1843 by a minister called Robert Cunningham. This wasn't just any school, no. This was the kind of place that churned out future lawyers, politicians, and people with complicated surnames. They even had electric light when the people in Falkirk were still lighting candles. I'm not even kidding on. The headmaster, Jai Cook Gray, was a right visionary apparently, right? He turned it into one of the biggest schools in Scotland at the time. But here's the twist. See, after Cook Gray died in 1902, the place fell to bits, financially skint, and then struck with some infectious disease. And by 1908, it shut its doors for good. No more posh cunts with comb hair and Latin textbooks, just silence and decay. That is, until the government clocked it. By 1911, the prison commissioners had their eye on it, looking for a new place to try something radical. See, up until then, YOs were being thrown into adult jails, locked up beside seasoned nutters and hardened crims. People were starting to notice that flinging a 16-year-old pickpocket in beside a bank robber maybe wasn't the best way to steer them back in the straight and narrow. So they says, right, let's try something new. Let's turn this fancy old school into a bostel. And that, he's and she's and theys and thems, is how Blair Lodge Academy, once a beacon of privilege, became the site of Scotland's first bostel, designed for young male offenders. No longer churning out lawyers, now it was churning out people who had made a mistake, hoping to set them right with discipline, education and hard graft. Sounds good, right? But here's the thing. What happened next wasn't exactly the miracle they'd hoped for. In fact, it led to some of the darkest headlines in Scottish jail history. As the years rolled on, the Borstal system started to show its cracks. What sounded good on paper, discipline, routine and tough love for wayward lads, was starting to look a lot like recycled Victorian punishment dressed in modern clobber. People were asking questions. Were we actually rehabilitating these YOs, or just teaching them to act hard, bottle up their trauma and play the system better next time? But in the 1980s, social attitudes had changed. YOs were being seen less as wee nuisances that needed the jail belt, and more as vulnerable individuals had slipped through the cracks of society. Broken homes, addiction and poverty abuse. Out went the Borstal banner, and in came the shiny new title. Her Majesty's Young Offenders Institution, Polmont. Sounded fancier, more progressive? Aye. But was it really that different? Kinda. The bones of the place were still the same. Big metal gates, barbed wire fences, cells built long before PlayStations were a thing. But the rhetoric changed. Polmont was now meant to be a place of rehabilitation, development and support. The idea was to steer YOs between 16 and 21 off the path to adult jails like Barlinnie or Shotts, and instead guide them towards education, skills and self-awareness. So what did that look like? Well, instead of the constant drill sergeant style abuse you might have seen in the past, YOs get access to vocational training, bricklaying, painting, hairdressing, mechanics. They even had things like anger management programs, drug and alcohol counselling and mental health support. Staff were trained not just as screws, but as offender development officers. That's what they were called. Whether they actually developed ND is up for debate. There was classroom blocks, a library, a gym, even chaplaincy programs for spiritual support. It was like somebody had drawn up a list of good ideas and stuck it on the wall. But reality, as usual, painted a grimmer picture. You see, on the surface, Polmont is evolving, but under the bonnet, it was still a powder keg. The place might have looked cleaner, the regime a bit softer, but many of the boys coming through the doors were still traumatised, angry and skint. Products of broken homes, broken systems and broken promises. The routine might have been polished up, but many cons still spent long hours banged up in their cells. Programmes get cancelled because of staff shortages and violence was rampant. Some cons thrived under the structure. Others, they crumbled under the weight of silence. Young lives full of potential, full of pain, were lost behind these walls. Suicides, overdoses, cries for help that went unanswered. The cracks began to show long before the headlines started screaming. Mental health provision was sparse. They tried to fix a shattered windscreen with a bit of sellotape. Isolation, long periods locked up, the weight of trauma, addiction, fear, hopelessness, all simmering away behind bars that promised change but delivered silence. Some of these boys came in carrying trauma like a bag full of bricks. Childhood abuse, poverty, addiction, neglect, you name it. Instead of being met with compassion or proper support, they were met with under-resourced staff, overstretched systems, and a culture that still leaned heavily on discipline over empathy. One of the first major cases that tore the lid off was William Lindsay, a 16-year-old boy who took his own life in 2018. He was sent to Polmont after being refused bail, even though social workers flagged he was at severe risk. Within 48 hours of arriving, he was dead. A young boy, alone, desperate, and failed. Then came Katie Allen, 21-year-old, no criminal record, a uni student, jailed for a hit and run whilst mad with it. She suffered bullying inside, self-harmed, and begged for help. Her mum daft found out she'd been refused mental health treatment in the lead up to her death. In 2018, she too took her own life inside Polmont. You see, these cases weren't isolated. They were a pattern, one that exposed a system crumbling under its own weight. The SPS and the Scottish Government were forced to launch inquiries. Headlines exploded. Public outcry grew. Campaigns were launched by the families demanding justice, change and accountability. But even then, the was at Polmont held firm. Despite promises of reform, many still feel it's more like a holding pen for lost souls than a place of healing. You see, when a jail becomes a place where a young person is more likely to die than be saved, it's no reflection on them, it's a reflection on us. Nowadays, Polmont operates as the national jail for young men aged 18 to 21. They come from every corner of Scotland, some on remand, others doing short stints, some in there for serious stuff, long term and even life sentences. Of course, they housed female prisoners and apparently even started housing cons. Some people that have passed through the gates you might know are the likes of Luke Mitchell or Aaron Campbell, the Scream's Chris Cunningham, and Glasgow's own King of Scotland, watch that Mike, Hawaii 5-0. But if we peel history back, right, Polmont wasn't the only YO's institution in the prison system. Another notable nick was HMP Longregend. Longregend's story kicks off in 1966 when the SPS opened it as a remand centre near Airdrie. Before it was a prison, the site was likely just open land, moorland or scrub. The SPS built it from scratch to tackle a growing problem. YOs aged 16 to 20 piling up in courts and needing somewhere to wait for trial. By the late 60s, Scotland's justice system was quaking under the weight of crime, and Longregend was meant to ease the strain on bigger jails like Barlinnie. Designed to hold up to 158 inmates, it was a high security setup, all concrete and steel, with a focus on keeping folk locked down tight. But was it built for control, or just a warehouse troubled young souls? Longregend's regime was less about reform and more about containment. As a remand centre, it wasn't big in rehabilitation. Most guys were there for weeks or months waiting for court, not even serving long sentences. The daily grind was brutal. Long lock-up hours, long dub-up hours, limited time in shared spaces, and basic grub served in cells or a canteen. The cells were small, most of the time shared with minimal comforts. Just a bed, a sink, and a bucket to shite in. A 1989 inspection report slated it, saying it had a poor regime, pointing to boredom, lack of physical education, and appalling conditions like metal grills trapping debris, including manure. Some of the guys get access to basic classes or gym time, but staff, outnumbered and under pressure, leaned hard on discipline. For YOs, many first-time offenders, it became a harsh wake-up call. But did this setup calm them down, or wind them up more? Longregend's history is scarred by dark moments, none louder than its suicide crisis. For the 80s to its closure, the jail was linked to multiple suicides, though exact numbers are hard to kind of pin down. A former officer in derelict places in 2007 claimed that quite a few young offenders took their own lives, blaming the tense aura of the place. A 1988 case where a 17-year-old hung himself sparked outrage and calls for a better mental health support, but change was slow. In July 1988, a riot caused 60 grand's worth of damage, leading to tighter controls and an even grimmer regime. There was a few fights and a few protests, but it was all fueled by overcrowding and frustration. But it was the suicides that left the deepest mark. How many young lives were lost to despair? See, Longregend's job was straightforward. Hold young YOs in remand, keep them secure, and get them to court. Warehousing them, serving courts across central Scotland, Glasgow, Lanarkshire and beyond. It was often packed, sometimes over the 158 capacity you were shocked to hear, leading to shared cells and frayed nerves. Unlike Polmont, which focused on sentenced young offenders, Longregend was a way station. Boys came in, waited, then left for trial or transfer, with high fences and strict routines, but the lack of programmes meant it wasn't fixing nobody. It was a pressure cooker, holding volatile young men with little hope or purpose. Was it keeping the system running, or just bottling up trauma? Longregend shut its doors in March 2000, part of SPS budget cuts and a shift in prison strategy. The official line was cost, running a high security remand centre, and Polmont could handle young YOs better. But the suicide crisis was massive. Public outcry of deaths in custody, plus reports of poor conditions, made Longregend a liability. The site was sold to a demolition mob, and by 2009 the cell blocks were razed, though the entrance and fences still stayed there, giving urban explorers something to look at. Scottish Screen even pitched it as a film set, calling it scary and atmospheric. But was it shut to save cash, or bury its failures? You see, Polmont and Longregend served as benchmarks in the history of the YOs, but there was also another institution located in Perth, which operated as a typical YOs, but eventually became one of the only open prisons for young offenders. This is a short tale of HMP Friarton. Friarton came to life around about 1963, when the SPS opened it as a detention centre for young male offenders aged 16 to 21. It was just a mile from Perth. The site was once the Friarton Fever Hospital, designed by Perth architects G Young in the 19th century. After the hospital shut its doors, the SPS saw a chance to repurpose the land, adding cell blocks, workshops and a learning centre to hold up to 89 inmates. It was one of two such centres in Scotland at the time, alongside Southend House in Kilmarnockshire, which later became HMP Glenochil. Friarton was born to ease the pressure when Southend hit capacity, and Nick meant to support HMP Perth's bigger operation. But was this hospital site a fresh start for young lads, or just a recycled relic? Take a wild guess. Friarton's regime was a cut above the grim lockups of other jails. Described as supportive, it aimed to make young YOs safe. The boys spent a lot of time out in the gaffs, with days filled with work and education. Everybody had access to learning. Near enough half of them were taking part in positive, purposeful programmes like literacy or vocational skills, setting them up for life outside. Work was varied, from farm tasks to trades like woodwork or metalwork, gaining them practical credentials. Cells were pretty much basic, but they were decent, with TVs and toilets, and family contact was a priority, with home leaves letting the guys visit their loved ones. Visits were relaxed, sometimes outdoors with the tea in the good weather, but a 2002 report flagged drab facilities and cuts to out of cell time due to staffing changes, hinting at cracks in the system. Was Friarton a real shot at reform, or was it a soon-to-be victim to the fractures in the system? Friarton's history is quieter than most, with no major riots or violent outbreaks making any headlines. The 2008 HMIPS report praised its safe environment, suggesting the regime kept things steady. But quiet doesn't mean perfect. A 2002 inspection noted boredom in limited facilities, with staff cuts slashing out of cell time by 11 hours a week, causing grief amongst the boys. Friarton served as a key cog in Scotland's youth justice system, starting as a detention centre in 1963, turning into a Borstal in 1967, and eventually becoming a YO's institution in April 1970. Its job was to hold young men convicted or on remand, and then set them up for release through education, work and family connection. By 1999, it was absorbed into HMP Perth, operating as Friarton Hall, a top-end unit for low supervision boys. It served Tayside and Fife, taking overflow for Polmont and acting as a bridge between jail and freedom. Community links were strong, with partner organisations helping cons transition back to society. But was it really setting people free, or was it just acting as a pit stop? Friarton's gates closed in early 2010 and merged with HMP Perth as part of SPS cost cutting and rationalisation. The facility, deemed underused and outdated, needed pricey upgrades to keep going. Its role was swallowed by Perth's main prison, and the site was bulldozed to make way for a housing estate. The exact date's a bit fuzzy, right, but by 2010, Friarton was history, as buildings replaced by homes overlooking the Tay. The closure reflected a shift in SPS strategy, focusing on bigger facilities like Polmont for young offenders. So what did shutting Friarton really achieve? Did it cut dead weight, or did it lose a vital rehabilitation link? I was in Polmont when they shut Friarton, and I can tell you, it wasn't the greatest idea they ever had. But I suppose it's the SPS we're talking about. They're not exactly the trough of great ideas. But anyway, we've come out the other side of the YOs, the so-called youth solution to Scotland's crime problems. But as we've seen, the system is supposed to break the cycle, often just spun people around in it. And if Polmont's the training ground for YOs, where do they end up if they don't straighten out? Here's where we transition, right? Polmont wasn't just a place to send troubled youths. It's part of a wider network across the country that served different purposes, different populations, and different needs. And depending on who you were, what you'd done, or what postcode you came for, the system had a place waiting for you. Scotland's modern prison estate became a kind of patchwork quilt. Stitch your get at their time, but each with its own unique function. You had your regional jails like HMP Greenock, HMP Dumfries, HMP Stockton, serving the west, the south and the capital respectively. These were your holding pens, your catch-all boxes. People on remand, short-termers, people waiting court dates. They all went through these gates. Didn't mean to rhyme that there. Then came the specialist jails. Jails like Castle Huntley, Scotland's Open Nick, where cons were prepped for release with a wee bit of freedom. You had Glenochil, shots, designed to hold long-term and high-risk offenders. Scotland's version of maximum security, with all the walls, watchtowers and whispers that come with it. But even within that structure, change was coming. The late 20th century saw the rise of private prisons in Addiewell, built and ran by private companies but filled with public pain. Then you had jails like Cornton Vale, the National Facility for Women, constantly under scrutiny for the way it handled trauma, mental health and addiction. Smaller prisons like Longregain, Northside and Friarton filled in the gaps over the years, often used for short sentences, training purposes or specific roles in the system. Many are now shut, but the legacy hangs about. What ties them all together is this: Scotland's prisons weren't built to follow a master plan. They were reactions to a crisis. A spike in youth crime, build Polmont. While we need a separate space, Cornton Vale. Overcrowding in the big city, patched with Greenock or Dumfries. Need to look modern, sell the job to a private company. It's no surprise then that you create Frankenstein's monster, just stitched up bits and pieces. But the next bit is important, because each of these jails played their own role. Some of them made headlines that were saw by the nation. Riots, scandals, hunger strikes, suicides, escapes, and aye, beasts hiding in plain sight. It's time for us to take a walk through the rest of Scotland's mad maze, which is the prison system. One lockup at a time, starting with the Green Gates of HMP Greenock. Greenock's a strange one in the Scottish prison system. It's not quite a local jail, not quite a long-term lockup, and not quite a women's nick, but somehow it's all three at once. That in itself makes it a bit of a Frankenstein's monster compared to the rest of the jails we've covered. Originally opened in 1910, Greenock Prison was meant to serve the West Coast, taking in a mix of remand and short-term prisoners. Built on the edge of a working class town famous for its shipyards, the jail sat right in the middle of communities that's been ravaged by poverty, drink and generational trauma. Also Martin Compston's acting. You could say Greenock's always mirrored the struggles of the place it lives in. No offence, Martin. Let's talk layout, right? Because this place is split up like a dodgy nightclub with too many VIP areas. First up you've got Ailsa Hall. This is where the bulk of the male prisoners go. Your remand cases, short-termers, and folk from around the west. Darrock Hall, which is female prisoners. Aye, that's right. Greenock's one of the only two mixed-gender prisons in the country. So already you've got a volatile dynamic in your hands. You've got Bute House for your short-term female offenders or those still waiting trial. And you've got Arran House and Criswell House. These are the crown jewels, reserved for long-term, low-supervision inmates. Criswell in particular is Scotland's national top-end facility. Think of it like a halfway house where lifers get a taste of freedom before they get out the gates for good. And that setup, it's both a blessing and a curse. You see, with all these populations under one roof, young men on remand, women with trauma histories, long-termers trying to keep their aids down, Greenock's always been one bad day away from chaos. It's like trying to run 3 prisons with the budget of half a one. And that's not just me saying it. The 2023 HM Inspectorate report was scathing, especially about the state of Ailsa Hall. They said it was unfit for purpose, and I quote, dark, damp, crumbling and overcrowded. Usual for the usual. Toilets shared between 5, leaks, staff shortages and prisoners locked up for 22 hours a day. It was like they were trying to run a Victorian jail in the 21st century. And surprise, surprise, people were suffering. Reports of mental health deteriorating, delays in through care support and minimal access to work and education. The inspection team said Greenock's regime was quote-unquote fragile. That's a polite way of saying it's hanging on by a thread. Or a shithole. Greenock takes credit, right? It's trying to punch above its weight. Criswell House is meant to be a beacon for rehabilitation. They're cooking their own meals, wearing their own clays and attending community placements. The idea is to ease them back into society and stop them from coming back. But all that good work gets undermined when the rest of the jail's crumbling and staff are stretched like a tenner in the bookies. Greenock is like a boat with too many passengers and not enough crew, and a hull full of leaks. It wants to be progressive, but it's anchored by outdated facilities, underfunding and systems that haven't evolved since the 90s. And yet, it needs to exist. There's no alternative in the West that can house women, short-termers, remand cases and long-termers. It's a vital part of the Scottish system, but unless somebody coughs up the cash to overhaul it, it will forever remain a relic. But how long for? Only time will tell. Next up, we're heading even further south to a place older, quieter, but every bit just as interesting. A prison with roots going back to the Great War and a past that's rarely spoken about. Buckle up, soldiers, because this next stop in this tour takes us to the borders in HMP Dumfries. Picture this, right? A bank robber blowing up an ATM to fund a romantic holiday in the Gambia and ending up trying to tunnel out the jail with nothing but lies and cheek. Welcome to HMP Dumfries, the jail where secrets get locked up tighter than the cons. Back in 1863, whilst Queen Victoria was sitting on her throne and folk were still getting jail for nicking a loaf, Dumfries Jail opened its doors to serve the people of Galloway. It was meant to be a local lockup, the kind of place you end up in if you've had one too many at the tavern or you'd nicked a shilling to keep the fire lit. Not I'm talking about 18th century problems. It was built with the old school Victorian touch. 5 main halls, cell blocks made of solid stone, a big imposing gate, and rules that were etched in granite. But the place didn't stay a simple house of correction. No for long anyway. By 1951, Dumfries was converted into a brothel, trying to turn wayward boys into men with a bit of structure and discipline. That experiment didn't last long. By 1965, it transformed again, this time into a young offenders institution. But even that rule changed. Today, HMP Dumfries is taking on a more specialised purpose. Dumfries holds a dual population, right? In one hand, it deals with short-term remand and convicted adult males for the local courts. On the other, it's Scotland's go-to jail for quote-unquote offence-related protection prisoners. That's the fancy term for cons that can't mix with the main population, because usually the nature of their crimes, think sex offenders, grassies or high-risk targets. There's 60 local cons and up to 135 protection cases. Total capacity has been bumped to 222 because, surprise, surprise, overcrowding strikes again. It's a quiet jail, controlled, ordered, but behind the walls, some pure wild characters have passed through it. One of the maddest tales to come out of Dumfries in recent memory involves a man called Russell Snowden. Russell was a seasoned bank robber with a love for explosives and holidays. Could have came from Govan. In 2017, he blew up an ATM in Langholm and walked away with 45 grand in Scottish notes. His explanation? He said, "Oh aye, I sold a car, officer." He sold a motor. Then what did he do? He spent nearly 2 grand to take his missus to the Gambia for a wee romantic break. As you do. The second he landed back in the UK, the police were waiting, slapped the cuffs on him and hauled him off to remand in HMP Dumfries. While inside, Snowden hatched an escape plan. But this wasn't the great escape, it was mere carry on tunnelling. He got caught, pled guilty to the theft and the failed breakout and landed a 10 stretch. Judge Lady Dorian summed him up perfectly and said a string of convictions for violence and dishonesty. Dumfries operates 5 residential halls, A, B, C, D and E, plus a B0 basement unit for observation cases. It doesn't have a full segregation wing like the bigger nicks, so if a con is struggling with their mental health or they need to be kept isolated, they're either kept behind their door or moved to what's called a safe cell or fired after a bigger jail. But don't be fooled. Dumfries might be small, but it's definitely no soft. Just full of weirdos. In September 2024, the Mental Welfare Condition paid the jail a wee visit to check in on how mental health services were being delivered. And the picture they painted was a bit of a mixed bag. On the bright side, folk praised the Band 6 mental health nurse, described her as brand new, always listening, gives good advice, which is the kind of praise that's rare in a jail report, right? The place also boasts a wellbeing garden, a gym refurb, football pitches, veggie plots, therapeutic sessions, and a decent link between the healthcare staff and the cons. One prisoner even said that this is well better. The prison staff talked to me using my first name. And that might not sound like much, but in jail, being treated like a human is half the battle. But there were complaints. Prisoners said they felt rushed, dismissed, or even ignored by some other members of the mental health team. A big issue that was raised is there was no access to psychological services. Turns out there's no in-house psychologists at Dumfries, which mean cons who were getting help at the last jail hit a brick wall when they landed there. Why? The jail struggles to get anybody that's in psychology because it's that out the road. So as a result, mental health nurses try their best to deliver psychoeducation and emotional support. But even they admit it's no the same as proper one-to-one therapy. The Commission fired off 4 formal recommendations. Number 1, get access to psychologists. Number 2, make care plans easier to access across the board. Number 3, keep regular reviews with proper evaluations. Number 4, sort out risk assessments, especially for those for the Dumfries area. HMP Dumfries is like the country's pressure release valve. It takes in cons other prisons can't deal with. The marked men, the vulnerable ones, the guys that only last 10 minutes in bar or shots. It's a prison that's trying to balance protection with rehabilitation. But with no in-house psychology and a heavy mental health load, it's like trying to fix a leak with a packet of toilet roll. You see, the truth is, Dumfries is adapted. It's calm, quiet, and if we believe the cons, a bit human. But the calm doesn't last forever, because back up the road, in the capital city itself, there's a prison that's big, bold, and full of contradictions. A place with a past wrapped in history, and a future still written in question marks. Next up in Patsy Crime, we're heading to HMP Edinburgh, known to most people as Stockton. Construction in Stockton began in 1914, right as the world was plunging into war. Aye, the First World War, that far back it was. But like many things in Britain back then, they ran out of budget and behind schedule. Some things never change. The first prisoners didn't arrive until 1919, after the guns had stopped and the trenches had emptied. Nestled in the west of Edinburgh in the Stenhouse area, the prison was built to serve the capital and its surrounding areas, taking in people from the Lothians, the Borders, and even bits of Fife. Should have put them in a colony. It was meant to be a modern facility for its time, but time moves fast in this game, and what was state of the art in 1919 quickly became dated by the 50s and the 60s. Now, Stockton's always been a mixed bag. It houses adult males, both those awaiting trial and those under sentence, short-termers, long-termers, lifers, and those under an order for lifelong restriction, which is kind of a fancy legal term for we can let you out, but probably won't. The halls are split up like wee schemes with names like Glenesk, Hermiston, Ingliston and Ratho. But despite the split, one thing unites the place. It's often packed, heavy with tension and struggling to meet demand. Its design capacity is 870, but it's usually running at over 900 prisoners a day. But there's one prisoner whose story stands out for all the wrong reason, and this is the story of Alan Marshall. So Alan Marshall wasn't some kind of hardened criminal. He was a 30-year-old daft from Glasgow, remanded in Stockton in March 2015 over a daft breach of the peace. Realistically, he should have been in and out, but instead, ended up in a body bag. Murdered, many would argue, but the very system meant to rehabilitate him. And here's what actually happened, right? Alan was having a mental health crisis inside. Like 4 days in, he's clearly struggling. But instead of compassion, instead of support, the response was brutal and downright evil. They say up to 17 screws descended on him in the seg unit. 17! He was pinned down, kicked, stamped on, restraint they called it. But to end his eyes, it was assault. Witnesses said he was stripped naked, bleeding, terrified, screaming for help. They dragged him face down like a dead animal across the flare. He'd been held down with feet on his head and back. By the time they stopped, he was unconscious. The post-mortem said his lungs filled with fluid. His brain sustained trauma. He died of positional asphyxia. In plain Scots, he suffocated under the weight of the screws. And here's the best thing about it. Not one of them faced a court. A fatal accident inquiry in 2019, 4 years later, found the officers involved had been mutually and consistently dishonest. The sheriff said his death was entirely preventable. And that's not up for debate. That's the legal ruling. But still, no prosecutions. Why? Because every single screw that touched Alan that day had been granted immunity before the inquiry even began by Dorothy Bain KC. Side note, Dorothy Bain's the same woman that knocked back Luke Mitchell's petition due to the fact it was her husband that put him away. In layman's terms, she's a corrupt cow. She gave them immunity, a licence to kill, some might say. His family, led by his aunt Sharon McFadden and brother Alistair, campaigned tirelessly. Years went by. Silence. Deflection. Denial. Until 2024. 8 years after Alan's death, Scotland's Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service announced a historic move. They instructed Police Scotland to investigate the Scottish Prison Service. No the screws, but the institution for corporate homicide. So just digest that. Not once has any public body in the UK ever been prosecuted for corporate homicide before. If charges are brought, it'll be unprecedented. An entire institution, the SPS, held accountable for a culture, for a system, for a death they just as well caused. See, this isn't about Alan anymore. This is about every other name we'll never hear. Every family that's been silenced. Every life chewed up by a prison system that treats people like animals. Alan was a dad, a brother, a nephew, no a statistic, no some paperwork in a drawer. His family put it plain and powerful. They said it took 8 years to get here. The investigation at the time was a sham. It was mishandled for day one. We're grateful it's finally been looked at, but justice delayed is justice denied. Officers had immunity. That gives them a licence to kill. The director of the inquest, Deborah Coles, said it straight. This is long overdue. Without the family's fight, Alan's violent and preventable death would have been buried, literally and figuratively. Alan's case might finally set a precedent, not just for Stockton, but for every jail in the country. Accountability, scrutiny, and maybe, just maybe, justice. But that's a big maybe. Although in 2006, Stockton experienced an instance where the roles were reversed, and instead it was the authority that fell victim to a prisoner. Scott Anderson was already a man marked by menace. He had a history, and not the kind you wear like a badge, but the kind that follows you about like a curse. Already convicted of serious violent crimes, he was no stranger to solitary confinement. The segregation unit, or the SEG as it's known, was meant to keep the likes of him away from the general population. But it turns out the biggest danger was already locked inside the room with him. It started like any other day behind these steel doors. The screws were going about their usual checks. I think Anderson was calm enough. But this wasn't just a guy with a temper. This was somebody primed to explode. When the screw stepped into the cell, Anderson pounced on him, grabbed him from behind and smashed his head repeatedly against the solid metal grille of the cell door. Air and air again. This wasn't just an assault. This was an ambush. The officer, who was a seasoned screw with years under his belt, was left traumatised. He survived, but only just. The psychological scars ran even deeper than the physical ones. Colleagues described him as clearly traumatised. His nerves rattled beyond repair. The governor at the time said it was one of the worst attacks he'd seen in decades, apart from the ones dished out by the screws, obviously. Anderson was subjected to stricter confinement measures. He was barred for receiving visits and placed in deeper isolation within the prison system. Another name that's etched itself in Stockton's dark history is George McGeoch. Originally from Glasgow, McGeoch was serving life for slashing the throat of Eric Innes, a 61-year-old bakery worker. A brutal murder, no remorse, and he even tried to set the body on fire after it. In June 2002, in Stockton, McGeoch struck again. He's already quite known for violent outbursts, but this time he held 2 prison nurses hostage in his cell, Ronnie Batt and Linda Johnson, with a razor blade pressed against Linda's throat. He claimed he wasn't getting proper pain relief and had been denied bereavement counselling after his ma died. For 5 hours, the jail was frozen. McGeoch told negotiators he wanted body bags, repeatedly threatened to kill the nurses, and at one point Batt admitted, "I genuinely thought we were going to leave the prison in a box." Eventually Ronnie Batt overpowered McGeoch and the screws stormed in. The siege ended and the nurses lived. McGeoch got 8 more years on top of his sentence. But that wasn't the only siege in Stockton's history. In June 2013, 2 inmates, Andrew Kinloch and James Quinn, decided to make their mark. Armed with makeshift weapons, razor blades melted into plastic handles, known as double whammies, they abducted a fellow con and barricaded him inside a cell within the segregation unit. Their demands was a KFC meal and a transfer to Barlinnie. I don't know what sounds worse in my opinion. I think I'd prefer a bargain bucket, to be honest. After negotiations, they agreed to honour one of their weapons for a quarter ounce of tobacco. This was the end of the 5-hour standoff as Kinloch and Kin realised there was nothing more to be gained. Both of them were later sentenced and made subject to orders for lifelong restriction, known as an LRO or an OLR, due to their previous convictions and the severity of their actions. But the darkest days of Stockton's history came long before these instances. Starting over 100 years ago, Stockton was the host to capital punishment. Stockton's gallows weren't public like the old days at the Tall Booth or the Calton Hill. By the time Stockton came into operation, hangings were private affairs, right? They were done behind closed doors, witnessed only by officials, and carried out with as little ceremony as possible. Still pretty grim, but a life ended by the state, with no crowd, no final speech, just silence and a rope. The executions at Stockton didn't happen often. In fact, only 7 men were executed there between 1923 and 1954. Let's just go through some of the names that left a bloodstain on the prison's past. Henry Johnson, 1923. Henry Johnson was the first man to be hung at Stockton. He'd been convicted of murdering a guy in a jealous rage. The gallows had barely settled into the stone when he became the first to face it. There was no media frenzy, no last minute plea. The trapdoor opened, woof, silence. A new chapter in Scotland's death penalty history had begun. Peter Thompson, 1925. Thompson was a violent guy with a shopping list of assaults, and a murder conviction was next. He went to his death cursing the judge and weeping for his maw. A bit a lot to say in the one breath, know what I mean? The prison staff later said that his execution haunted the halls for weeks. He screamed the whole walk to the noose apparently. So he must have been quite a loud guy. David Bennett, 1931. Now this one kinda shook the city. Bennett killed a young woman during a robbery gone wrong. Public pressure to hang him was enormous. People wrote letters begging for the rope. Justice, they cried. But after his execution, some people started asking questions about whether the evidence was as solid as the Crown claimed. By this point, it was too little too late. Andrew Sloan, 1947. Post-war Edinburgh was a city trying to rebuild, but inside Stockton, the rope was still working. Sloan, convicted of a brutal domestic murder, was hung at dawn. It was said he refused the last meal, refused the chaplain, and walked to the gallows with dead eyes. He left behind a wife and 2 bairns. John Lee, 1951. Lee's case nearly stopped the hangman working altogether. His final words, quote unquote, "There's no justice in this system." He went to the rope calm, said a prayer, and then dropped. There was a rumour that the rope nearly snapped, a symbol that some said that maybe the country was losing its stomach for state-sanctioned killing. Thomas Hardy, 1953. Hardy was a repeat offender, hung after a murder during a robbery spree. But here's the twist. Screws claimed that he begged to be executed, said he couldn't face life behind bars. A death wish delivered by the state. George Robertson, 1954. George Robertson was the last guy to ever get hung at Stockton, and one of the last in Scotland. He murdered a fellow boozer during a fight, and the jury brought back a quick guilty verdict. He was hung just after dawn on August 5th, 1954. The gallows were dismantled no long after, and the noose was retired. By the late 50s, public opinion had shifted. People were starting to realise that killing a guy, even a murderer, made us no better than them. And in 1965, capital punishment for murder was finally abolished in Britain. Although it took till 1998 to get fully written out of law, Stockton's gallows had already seen their last swing. But the ghost of the scaffold still lingers. Woo, spooky! And while the SPS scrambles to cover its arse, there's another question simmering under the surface. If this happened in Stockton, one of Scotland's biggest, most visible prisons, it's not a patch on what's been going on up high in the hills of Clackmannanshire, out the way, out the public eye, and full to the brim with Scotland's most dangerous men, the lifers, the career cons, the time bombs. Silence is strategy, violence is currency, and some secrets never leave the was. Next up is HMP Glenochil. Clackmannanshire, early 1960s. Scotland's industrial lungs, which are the coal mines, are starting to choke. The black gold that once powered the nation's empire is running out. In places like Glenochil Colliery, once buzzing with around 900 workers, are falling silent. The National Coal Board, skint and slumping, decides to punt the land. And that's where the state swoops in. The prison system's bursting at the seams. Reform's a word on everybody's lips, but punishment is still a game. So the SPS buys up the land in the shadow of the Ochil Hills and decides this will be the site for a new kind of institution. But they weren't building a traditional jail, no. Glenochil was opened in 1966 as a detention centre, the home of the so-called short sharp shock. It was a brutal wee experiment aimed at young offenders, mostly teenage boys, a lot of them for schemes like Postal, Easterhouse, Drumchapel and Govan. The theory: hit them hard, hit them fast and scare the crime right out their system. We're talking military style discipline here. Grueling routines, early rises, bed checks, shouted orders, silence in the halls, no back chat, no freedom. If you moved too slow, you ran laps. You spoke at a turn, you scrubbed flares. The screws were more like drill sergeants than social workers, just like the typical approach by jails and institutions of that era. But the truth is, the place was built in a hurry. They reused the old colliery buildings to save cash. The miners' bathhouse turned into cells. The canteen converted into an education wing, though no much education ever happened. The medical room that once patched up pit injuries became the place you were dragged if you get battered. Obstacles, there was plenty. Firstly was the land itself. It was riddled with mine shafts and environmental risks left behind for decades of coal extraction. The ground was unstable in bits, so they couldn't just build heavy structures right away. Then there was the locals. Tilibody and the surrounding villages weren't exactly thrilled about having a bad boys jail plonked on their doorstep. The council made the SPS agree to blend the place in. That's why, to begin with, all the staff houses were painted olive green, camouflaged against the hill, so the prison couldn't be seen for Main Street and Alva. Imagine that. Try to hide a full prison with paint. But maybe the biggest issue was ideological. By the late 60s, criminologists were already shouting that the short, sharp shock approach didn't work. Took them long enough. It traumatised boys instead of rehabilitating them. The boys inside were not coming out reformed. They were angrier, harder, with a chip on their shoulder and a new skill set in violence. And Glenochil quickly gained a rep, not as a school of reform, but a boot camp for brutality. The first decade saw regular reports of violence between cons, and also for the staff. Officers back then had free rein. It was old school, discipline with little oversight. Riots, they were brown. Suicides, a few. Mental health support, you guessed it, non-existent. Still the state pressed on. They expanded the site. They thought if we could just keep building more wings, modernise it bit by bit, they'd somehow fix the problem. But you can't fix a broken idea with more concrete. You see, that's the foundations Glenochil was built on. Not just literal coal dust and steel, but failed social policy, political pressure, and a need to show the public that something was being done about Scotland's wayward youth. And as we'll see, Glenochil wouldn't stay at detention centre for very long, because things were only getting started. In 1975, officially became a young offenders institution, part of a wider shift in the penal policy across the UK. The idea to rehabilitate rather than punish. This was anything but a smooth transition. As Glenochil shifted to a YOI, it took in more long-term boys, aged 16 to 21. Many of them were for tough schemes in Glasgow, Dundee and Fife. Waynes with nowhere else to go. Many had grown up in care, already institutionalised before they could vote. Whilst the policy aim was rehabilitation, the reality was very different. Conditions were still bleak. Reports for the 1980s show overcrowded dorms, a lack of qualified staff, and very little in the way of education or psychiatric support. By the mid-1980s, the place became known for tension. There were spikes in self-harm, suicide attempts, and a rising number of violent assaults, both inmate on inmate and against staff. The worst thing about it was the number of suicides that plagued Glenochil during this era, especially in the early 80s. These tragedies brought media attention, with headlines painting a picture of a system that was failing Scotland's most vulnerable boys. It reached Parliament. MSPs and MPs alike raised concerns about Glenochil's rising violence and deteriorating mental health support. Some called it a powder keg with locks. In one adjournment debate, Glenochil was mentioned as an example of a prison system that matched punishment but failed at purpose. Pressure mounted on the Scottish Prison Service to review how young men were being handled. Campaigners argued that Glenochil was churning out more hardened cons than it was saving. The Scottish press began paying closer attention. Local newspapers in Clackmannanshire, Stirling and beyond covered stories of assaults, riots and suicide attempts. Families of the young lads began speaking out, claiming their sons were pushed deeper into despair by a place meant to help them change. The Stirling Observer, the Herald and even BBC Scotland picked up on the growing unrest. And eventually the image of Glenochil started changing. No longer just a quiet detention centre, it became synonymous with brutal regime clashes and institutional failure. The 1980s in Glenochil's history would also mark a seismic shift as it would begin to integrate over 21s into the environment. Suddenly, Glenochil's violent reputation would reach all new levels. Right in the top flat with that one. The turning point came when the SPS approved the construction of 4 new housing blocks. They weren't converted colliery baths like the early days. These were purpose-built brick for brick to lock up grown men who were in for years, if not decades. Each of the 4 blocks were built with 3 levels, 124 single cells per block, fitted with proper windows to let in natural light, allegedly, and geared towards containing inmates who weren't just passing through. These were prisoners with histories of violence, sex offences, gang affiliations or mental health issues. Many had already served time elsewhere. Glenochil became the next stop on a long, hard road. This wasn't just an expansion, it was a full-blown rebrand. The decision to start taking Air 21s meant the prison's identity had to change. Staff needed retrained, regimes reshaped, and security get beefed up. Glenochil was no longer about reforming wayward teenagers. It was now about containing and managing adult criminals, many of whom were volatile, institutionalised, or downright dangerous. The SEG unit, built as part of this shift, became crucial. It was here that the SPS could stash the most disruptive prisoners, those on the brink or actively causing chaos. And as Glenochil's reputation grew, so did its inmates' profile. Sex offenders, violent offenders, lifers, and guys on OLRs were now coming through its gates. In a way, Glenochil mirrored the broader trends in Scottish justice. A system straining under rising prison populations, drug-fueled crime, and repeat offenders. The short, sharp shock was quietly shelved, replaced by long-term containment and risk management, and the atmosphere changed and all. The air got a bit heavier. Staff spoke of rising tension. Gang disputes simmered beneath the surface. Assaults became more brutal, more targeted. And soon enough, Glenochil would become the scene of riots, hostage-taking, suicide, and even murder. In 1994, Glenochil fell victim to one of the worst riots in its history. It started like many do, with a grudge and an opportunity. By this point, Glenochil was already infamous. A breeding ground for violence where hardened criminals rubbed shoulders with broken addicts and career nut jobs. On this particular day, early January, the wing was on edge. It exploded when a gang of cons took a prison officer called Tom Jones hostage. It's not unusual for the cons to riot. He was battered across the head with a table leg, dragged inside a cell and used as a human shield. Petrol bombs were apparently thrown and the riot squad called in and the wing transformed into a war zone. The ringleaders were soon identified. They were later dubbed the Glenochil 8. You had George Goofy Docherty, Jimmy Holland, Tam Monaghan, Matt Young, Stephen Given, Richard Wiper, Sean Kyle and Billy Weatherall. They covered their faces with shirts and prison gear, but they were still recognised by the screws. Must have obviously been known. Their demand started half comical. Sack the Select board, they were shouting. But things turned dark quite quickly. They wanted smack, fags, booze, blankets, and eventually a helicopter, as if they weren't high enough. Threats were made to gouge out the hostages' eyes. Thousands of pounds worth of damage was done. The riot lasted 24 hours. When it finally ended, Tom Jones was freed and the Glenochil 8 were split up and shipped across the system. Some went to Barlinnie's new segregation unit known as the Wendy House. Others awaited trial. But then came the twist. You see, Billy Weatherall, considered the least dangerous of the 8, He was a petty thief and a drug addict. He turned crown. He flipped on them. And that's when things got really deadly. The day before he was set to testify, Billy Weatherall vanished. He was last seen at 10 p.m. in Maryhill. The next morning, his body was found in a lay-by in Bishopton. He'd been shot in the head. The trial fell apart. With no witnesses, the other 7 guys walked free, at least for additional time. The Glenochil 8 trial was branded a complete disaster for the Crown, and Billy Weatherall's murder remains unsolved to this day. It was almost 20 years later before Glenochil was in the media again for another murder, but this time it was behind bars. This is the story of a guy described by a Scottish judge as having one of the worst criminal records ever seen. His name is James Bernard Patrick O'Rourke, aka Porky. By the teens he was already a recurring guest at Her Majesty's pleasure. In 1992, aged just 22, he committed his first murder and got life for it, but jail never really straightened him out. In fact, it made him worse. You see, inside he thrived on chaos. Violence wasn't just a last resort, it was his language. Here's just a snippet of Porky's greatest hits, right? In 1997, he got 6 years for 2 savage assaults. 2002, he got 8 years for assault and abduction. 2004, he got 4 years for assault to injury. In 2005, he got 8 years for assault with a weapon, leaving his victim near death. And in 2019, he got 9 years for attempt murder. He stabbed a guy and left him disfigured for life. People like to talk about rehabilitation in the prison system, right? But there's always that 1% that no matter what you do to them, they'll never change. Porky fits into that demographic. You see, jail's very different from what you see in America. Serious incidents do happen, but they're usually more calculated and rarely random. For instance, slashing, stabbings, etc. Rarely you'll ever hear of a murder in jail, unless Porky's involved. It was the 9th of January 2021, inside the walls of HMP Glenochil, when Porky struck again. He lured fellow con Dean Ramsey into his cell. No warnings, no noise. Once he had him in, he tied the boy's wrists, made a ligature out of bed sheets, and strangled him near enough to death. Ramsey suffered a brain injury, so severe that he never recovered. 2 days later, he passed away in hospital. The screws said Porky walked out his cell afterwards, cool as you like, wiping his hands and his head. He just finished a workout. And he turned to an Archon and said, quote unquote, "Just 'cause I'm old, he thinks I'm a dafty." Well, it cost him his life. But it wasn't just Dean Ramsey's life it was lost that day. By July 2022, Porky was at the High Court in Glasgow. He pled guilty straight off the bat. But even with the plea, Lord Arthurson had no time for sympathy. The judge said O'Rourke had by far the worst criminal record he'd ever seen, and called the killing what it was: a callous, remorseless and thoroughly brutal execution. Porky got another life sentence. No surprise there, but this time he's going to serve at least 23 years before he can even ask to be let out. And let's be honest, with a past like his, it's likely he's never going to see daylight again. Let's just say I wouldn't want to skip that guy in the dinner queue, you know what I'm talking about? A very dark chapter in Glenochil's history, although some people might argue that things would take a darker twist, if that's even possible. When the jail made the decision to dedicate a large portion of its capacity to sex offenders. It's only a matter of time before you land in this subject, innit? Up to the 1990s, Glenochil had already built a rep as a hard-nosed jail, a place to shove long-term, high-risk prisoners out the road. But with overcrowding and pressure building in our Scottish jails, Glenochil found itself right in the middle of another controversial shift. In the late 90s to early 2000s, the SPS began to designate specific facilities across the country to manage sex offenders. Not just to punish them, but to separate and protect them from mainstream cons. After a series of violent incidents elsewhere, notably in places like Peterhead and Barlinnie, the SPS needed somewhere new, modern enough to handle the challenge, but remote enough to avoid public outrage. That somewhere was Glenochil. Glenochil's layout made it ideal, right? With any new blocks built in the early 80s, there was space to create segregation, to isolate certain prisoners and maintain strict control of their movements and interactions. Each block could essentially function as its own wee isolated prison, ideal for keeping different categories of prisoner apart. By the early 2000s, the SPS formally started transferring convicted sex offenders into Glenochil for Peterhead, Perth, Barlinnie and other institutions, filling the halls with men convicted of the darkest of crimes. But this move wasn't just practical, it was political. See, public anger about sex offenders had reached boiling point in the 90s, fueled by high-profile cases like the World's End murders. The SPS were keen to demonstrate control, safety and rehabilitation efforts publicly, with Glenochil at the centre of this controversial policy shift. As you might imagine, this didn't go down quietly. Local residents in Tullibody, Menstrie, Alva and the wider Clackmannanshire area, people who'd lived next to Glenochil pretty well up to that point, were not exactly chuffed to hear about their neighbourhood prison was becoming a national hub for nonces. The local community was worried sick about safety. Newspapers ran sensationalist headlines. Local politicians got involved, demanding reassurances. Protest groups formed briefly, arguing that the decision was dangerous and irresponsible, especially with housing estates and families living nearby. But despite the uproar, the SPS stood firm. The facility was modernised further, reinforced with heightened security measures. Staff received specialised training to handle offenders with this background, and quietly but purposely, Greenock became one of Scotland's main sex offender institutions. Inside the walls, the reality was harsh. Sex offenders were held in dedicated blocks, often isolated completely from the mainstream prisoner population for their own safety. Attacks on the sex offenders were frequent in mixed facilities elsewhere. At Glenochil, it was no different to start with. Violence and threats forced the prison to tighten control, often locking down entire groups of prisoners down for extended periods. Glenochil quickly developed a complex hierarchy. Mainstream prisoners despised the beasts in the segregated units. Staff had to carefully manage the balance, knowing full well that any mix-ups, misplacements or lapses in security could lead to serious harm, or even death. This wasn't just paranoia. There was repeated incidents of violence against sex offenders. Glenochil became notorious for prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, often fueled by hatred towards sex offenders. Incidents of self-harm and suicides also spiked. The psychological toll on both inmates and staff was immense, and the prison became even more of a powder keg. The shift to house sex offenders took on national attention when Glenochil became home to notorious inmates like Angus Sinclair, the World's End murderer. Sinclair was one of Scotland's most infamous sex offenders, responsible for the rape and murders of teenagers Christine Eadie and Helen Scott in 1977. When Sinclair arrived at Glenochil following his 2014 conviction, it sparked renewed media scrutiny, protests and questions about the safety, suitability and morality of holding notorious sex offenders in such close proximity to local communities. Sinclair would eventually die in Glenochil in March 2019, but not before leaving a lasting stain in the prison's already controversial reputation. The coal mines to chaos, Glenochil's seen it all. It's been a detention centre, a borstal, a lockup for Scotland's hardest men, and now it's one of the main hubs for sex offenders and some of the country's riskiest lifers. Whether it's riots, sieges or murder, Glenochil's reputation's carved out in blood, sweat and concrete. But next up, we're going to return to Glasgow, home of the greats, a place that's seen more nicks than the bouncers at Savoy. This Nicks prison is just as famous as Barlinnie, with just as much a colourful history. Starting off as an RAF base before becoming a borstal, and then eventually opening its doors to some of Scotland's most hideous, hairy-arse cons the country has ever seen. This is the story of HMP Low Moss. By the way, don't mind the costume change. Let's wind the clock back to 1939, when the world was getting tooled up for the tanks up. World War II. It was RAF Bishop Briggs, a Royal Air Force base built to keep the bandits at bay. Amassed with concrete pans and wooden huts, with massive barrage balloons floating above, tethered to the ground to stop German bombers getting too close to Glasgow shipyards. It was home to number 18 Balloon Squadron and number 15 Maintenance Unit, a proper military setup, right? The place was buzzing during the war, with RAF boys coming and going. It even doubled as a transit camp for troops moving from the south of England to the wilds of Scotland. A very different type of guest compared to later years. But after the war, the balloons came down and RAF Bishop Briggs got a new gig. For a wee while it was a training school for the Royal Military Police. Then in the 1960s it housed 388 signals unit, using radars to score mock bombing runs around Glasgow. Just couldn't get enough of the good bomb stuff, you know. But by 1966 the RAF packed up and the site was left gathering dust. Fast forward to 1968 and the SPS spots the empty RAF site and thinks, you know what? Let's fling people in there. The old wooden huts and prefab buildings like Davidson House were perfect for the low security setup. HMP Low Moss was born. Designed for short-term prisoners, guys serving less than 3 years for car thieves and pub scrappers. So the setup was pretty basic, right? You'd 11 dormitory style huts linked by narrow corridors, with no privacy and bog standard toilets. It was like living in a glorified shed, right? But it held up to 343 prisoners. No, they capped it at 307 to keep things a bit manageable. Probably the last time they ever managed that, but we'll get there. Back then, Low Moss was a bit of a doddle compared to the heavy duty nits like Barlinnie. It was for low risk prisoners, medium to low supervision, serving sentences just as short as a few months. But even in the 70s and the 80s, the place was showing its age. The wooden huts were falling apart, and the corridors were so tight you could barely swing a cat. Visitors and cons were moaning about the setup. Visit rooms were like a military drill, with tables and rigid lines and screws watching your every move. CCTV was everywhere, and the screws were apparently quite heavy-handed, making visits feel like you've been caught smuggling in Thailand. Every few years, the SPS had to beg for extensions to keep Low Moss open. In 1981, they got the nod to stay open till 1986, waiting for shots to get a refurb. Then in 1988, the council kicked up a fuss, demanding a public inquiry, but they eventually settled on a 3-year extension instead of 5. By 1992, they let it run till 2002. In 2003, the Scottish Executive gave it another 10 years, but it was very clear Low Moss was in borrowed time, a creaky old relic that just couldn't keep up with modern prison standards. By the early 2000s, Low Moss was a joke. The wooden huts were rotten, the dorms were a privacy nightmare, and the whole place just screamed past its sell-by date. The SPS knew it was time for a proper glow-up. In 2007, they shut the old jail down, flattened the lot, and started planning a new, brand new HMP Low Moss. A state-of-the-art nick that could handle the toughest of nut jobs. You'd be surprised to hear that the rebuild wasn't plain sailing. More like the Titanic, I would say. East and Bartonshire Council played a bit of council tug-of-war, saying no to the plans, but the Scottish Executive overruled them in January 2007, pushing for a private finance initiative. And the new Scottish Government in 2000 said, everybody just calm down and let us sort this one out. They ditched the private funding and went public, making Low Moss the first publicly built prison in Scotland in nearly 30 years. Carillion, which is a big construction mob, got the contract in May 2009, and by the February in 2010, the diggers were in. This wasn't just a refurb, it was a total transformation. The new Low Moss finished in March 2012. It was 3 times the size of the old one, with space for 700 cons and 300 screws. It was built to medium security specs, meaning it could take the hardest of bastards, not just short-turners. The design was meant to give the appearance of a community centre rather than a jail, with landscape and big windows for natural light. In the jail, it had wide corridors, 6 workshops, kitchens, classrooms, and 2 3-storey accommodation blocks, each with 4 wings controlled by a central hub. Every cell had an ensuite, no more sharing your shite with 10 other guys, right? The SPS called it, quote unquote, state of the art, designed to cut down the staff babysitting the cons so they could focus on rehabilitation programmes. So they say. The first 100 cons rolled in for Barlinnie in March 2012, a week ahead of schedule. The Governor, Mick Stoney, was buzzing, saying the setup would get cons out their cells, working their 9 to 5 earning privileges instead of lying about watching the telly. How long did it last? Power to the cells was cut during the day and the tellies went off at night to discourage people living like vampires. It was all about rehabilitation, trying to break the cycle of crime. But as we'll soon see, fancy facilities didn't mean a smooth ride. Low Moss might look shiny, right? But on the inside, it managed to attract its fair share of scandals and grim headlines. You see, when Low Moss reopened, right, in 2012, it was meant to be a beacon of modern prison life. But by 2013, it was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. A report by HM Chief Inspector of Prisons revealed 165 prisoner assaults in a single year. 15 of them were serious attacks, 140 were kind of minor scraps, and 10 were on the screws. was also 5 concerted indiscipline incidents, mostly sit-down protests and one dirty protest, a shite protest, a jobby rebellion. The report said most cons felt safe and staffing was decent, but the numbers don't lie. It was a volatile nick. By 2016 things get worse. The Daily Record called Low Moss Scotland's most violent jail. With 50 assaults and cons in 4 years, an insider said the place was full of quote-unquote very violent men. No shit, Sherlock. Dougie Ross, Scottish Tory, was raging, saying fancy facilities didn't make a jail safer and the government needed to focus on controlling prisoners and not just kitting out gyms and classrooms. The SPS spat back, saying they don't tolerate violence and report incidents to the police. Nobody likes a grass. Low Moss was built to hold 784 prisoners. By 2022, Low Moss was bursting at the seams. Inspectors found that the SPS had added 100 extra spaces under Project 100, replacing single beds with bunks, turning single cells into doubles. These cells were tiny, designed for one, and now 2 people were crammed in, sharing a toilet and a shower. Obviously not together, sometimes. And deodorising themselves with each other's farts. During COVID, when cons were locked up 24 hours a day, it was hell. Chief Inspector Wendy Sinclair Govan called it unreasonable, saying it was fine for sleeping, but torture for long lockdowns. Some cons get just 1 hour of fresh air every 3 days because of COVID rules. It was madness. The SPS admitted overcrowding was never desirable, but they said they had no choice. They couldn't control how many people get locked up. They put their hopes in a new mega jail, HMP Glasgow, replacing Barlinnie. But that was years away. Wendy Sinclair Govan pointed out Scotland's remand numbers were sky high compared to Europe, and community alternatives could ease the pressure. But for now, Low Moss was a pressure cooker. And the cons are feeling the squeeze. And speaking of COVID, right, Low Moss was hit hard in 2021. A Daily Record report quoted families saying the virus was out of control, with cons dropping like flies. There was 20 confirmed cases and a lot more were isolating. There was a nurse that actually called it pure hell, saying that staff shortages left nurses fearing for their lives. Infected cons were wandering about, doing laundry and gardening, spreading the virus like wildfire. Families were raging that short-term remand prisoners weren't tested, letting COVID rip through the halls. The governor get pelters for not getting a grip, with Low Moss having the worst COVID stats of any Scottish nick. The SPS denied a full lockdown, but admitted Kelvin Hall was the hotspot. It was a shambles. Pure and simple. One of the biggest controversies hit in 2023 when the Daily Record blew the lid off plans to move Tiffany Scott, a trans prisoner formerly known as Andrew Burns, from Low Moss to a women's jail. Scott, a violent offender with male genitalia, had female screws ordered to do strip searches, which kicked up a right fuss. Female screws refused, saying it violated their rights, and one of them actually said Scott had a meltdown when the transfer was blocked after the Daily Record blew the story. The Scottish Prison Officers Association got involved, with Phil Fairley demanding answers from management. The SPS kept tight-lipped, saying they don't comment on individuals. But the scandal sparked a wider debate about trans prisoners and safety in jails. Nicola Sturgeon took the heat, and the policy on moving violent trans prisoners to women's nicks was paused. Low Moss was right at the heart of the storm. Low Moss has been a magnet for media attention, and it's no surprise why. From its shiny reopening to its grim scandals, the press have been all at it like a rash. When it opened in 2012, the BBC was going on about its state-of-the-art facilities, hyping up the wide corridors and rehab programmes. They quoted the SPS saying it eased overcrowding at Barlinnie, which was 60% air capacity. But even then, they admitted it wouldn't fix Scotland's prison crisis. By 2013, the tone shifted. The BBC reported on the 165 assaults, quoting Inspector David Strang saying staffing was decent but the violence was a worry. Okay. The Daily Record went harder in 2016, calling it Scotland's most violent nick and quoting insiders about the chaos inside. They even dug up stories about cons on Spice, acting like quote-unquote fight dogs. Overcrowding's still a massive problem in Low Moss, if you haven't guessed already. The jail just can't process people awaiting offender-relating programmes which are designed to rehabilitate. They're even cancelling some courses in order to deal with the backlog. The problem here, right, is guys don't have any motivation to adapt to the rules of the regime, because there's no incentives like Castle Huntley for long-termers chasing parole and home leaves, because until they do these programmes, They're gone nowhere. Bearing in mind, these are the people deemed by society to be that much of a risk to the public, they need to be jailed for years. So what results do we expect to achieve here? But what I will say is, right, Low Moss has had its wins, although a few when it comes to rehabilitation. You see, in 2016, a BBC report praised a scheme run with Turning Point, helping short-term cons get back on their feet, offered support with housing, benefits and jobs. All the stuff that stops people re-offending. You could say the results were admirable, right? Less than 17% of cons on the scheme went back to jail, and over 40% cut down on drugs and dodgy behaviour. Governor David Abernethy was chuffed, saying the partnership with charities was a game changer. Who would have thought that, eh? Offering cons support upon release would contribute to their rehabilitation. Game changer indeed, eh? The jail's got a link centre where cons can sort out employment, housing and addiction issues. There's also a fathers programme run by Early Years Scotland, helping dads with young wains stay connected. You've got religious services, Bible study, events for Christmas and Eid. Keep spirits up for some of them. The design itself with its bright, airy spaces and college-like vibe is meant to inspire change and not just punishment. Inspector reports have called it a good and positive nick. Aye, for 10 minutes. Low Moss is a microcosm of Scotland's prison system. Full of ambition, but plagued by problems. The shift from a wartime RAF base to a low security nick, then to a modern medium security jail, shows how the system's had to adapt. But the violence, overcrowding and scandals prove that fancy buildings don't fix everything. Scotland's got one of the highest imprisonment rates in Europe, and Low Moss is feeling the strain. Low Moss, a place where Glasgow's hardest and most broken end up, trying to find a way out. Next up, we're heading to the wilds of North Lanarkshire, to one of the most notorious prisons in Scotland. The heavyweight champion of heavy jailbait cons, locking up the most serious offenders since the late 1970s. A legacy cemented in the annals of Scottish prison history, with riots, disorder and all-round anarchy. And that's just in the first night centre. Next up is HMP Shots. 1978, and Scotland's prison system is feeling the weight of serious offenders needing a secure spot. Enter HMP Shots, a brand new purpose-built jail in Cantelaw Road designed to hold 528 male prisoners serving sentences of 4 years or more. It was a fortress for people transferred from other jails, often because they needed tighter control. The jail was a lifeline for the Shots community, which was feeling the brunt of the closure of the local coal mines. Jobs at the jail gave the area a much needed boost, making it a cornerstone of the local economy. By 1987, the jail was bursting at the seams, so they stuck on an extension to take in more cons. But it was in 1990 where Shots would experience one of its most infamous incidents. A good old hall riot with a side order, a hostage taking. It's the morning of April 10th, 1990, and Shots is running its usual tight ship. But trouble's brewing. Just days after the Strangeways riot shook Manchester, sparkling unrest across UK jails, 40 cons at Shots decided to act. They take care of B Hall, a two-flare section of the jail barricading doors and creating a makeshift stronghold. In the chaos, he sees Jim Rankin, a 30-year-old screw from Motherwell. Rankin is now their hostage, and the jail is thrown into lockdown. The rest of the cons are stuck in their gaffs, and word spread fast. Shots is in crisis. For nearly 20 hours, B-halls are worled apart. The cons, many serving life sentences, had Rankin in a space with overturned tables and scattered debris. The hall's layout, cells along corridors, a central area for activities, becomes a maze of tension. Negotiators for the SPS are shouted in, wanting to defuse the situation through talks. Outside, the police and jail officials, they get together and they're prepping for any outcome. The media gets wind of it, and headlines start painting a picture of violence, some linking it back to Strangeways' destruction. Inside, the cons' grievances likely centre on conditions, overcrowding, lack of privacy, and a regime that leaves little room for hope. But no clear demands are recorded. On April 11th, the deadlock breaks. Rankin took an opportunity. What he done was, he takes a chance when the con's only looking, bolts for the first flare landing, and jumps over the stairwell. He lands, and quite rightly so, puts the boot down. His escape catches the cons off guard, disrupting their control. Prison staff moves swiftly and using the moment to re-enter B Hall and restore order. The standoff ends without serious injuries, which is a rare outcome in these kind of situations. B Hall is wrecked. There's smashed furniture, scattered goods, and a sense of it might have been. Rankin's checked for injuries. He's pretty much fine. He gets back home to his family. Apparently, his actions get praised for Lord James Douglas Hamilton, who commands his quote-unquote great courage and presence of mind. The negotiators are recognised for their role in keeping the situation from escalating. The cons are sent back to their cells, and the SPS begins assessing the damage. Dr John Reid, the local MP, voices concerns about Shot's role in housing high-risk inmates, hinting at community unease. The 1990 hostage crisis shines a light on the challenge facing HMP Shots in Scotland's prisons at the time. Reports of the era, like those in the Herald, describe it as a siege, but details on the con side are a bit thin. Some sources suggest it was a protest against conditions, cells with no privacy, a system just stretched too thin. Others seen it as a ripple of strange ways calls for reform. The lack of clear demands and limited records make it kinda hard to pin down. The 1990 HMP Shots hostage crisis was a pivotal moment, a 20-hour clash that tested the jail's limits. For the takeover of B Hall to Rankin's escape, it's a story of high stakes. But what other trials awaited Shots, and how did they shape its path? By the 2000s, Shots is home to 50% lifers, the highest in Scotland, making it a place where time stretched long and heavy. The 2007 inspection report called it stable, a far cry from its early days when violence was the talk of the town. Single cells, no overcrowding, and a decent relationship between staff and cons helped keep things calm. But it wasn't perfect. You'd unscreened toilets, grotty cells, and limited job training were sore points. You see, Shots had some unique setups, like the National Integration Centre, which was known as the NIC, which took in cons starting sentences of 8 years or more, no sex offenders mind, to prep them for mainstream jails. In 2007, the NIC had up to 116 cons. Some of them were staying there for up to 2 years. Then you'd Care House, a top end for low supervision cons nearing release, holding 46 of its 59 spaces that year. The units showed that Shots was trying to balance locking up people with giving them a path forward, but the old buildings were starting to show their age. Fast forward to 2012, and it was time for a massive overhaul. The original Shots was knocked down, and a shiny new jail rose up in the same site, bumping the capacity to 538. You see, the rebuild was all about modernising. Think like eco-friendly designs, better security, and spaces built for rehabilitation. It went the old B, C and D halls in Care House, and then came Lament Hall and Allerton Hall, each holding about 269 cons. Allerton's got 4 flares, 1 and 2 for protection cases, 3 for mainstream, and 4 for the NIC, which now holds around 60 long-termers. Lament is all mainstream across its 4 flares. There's also a 14-cell segregation and reintegration unit, SRU to call it, for up to 12 cons needing isolated for safety or discipline. The SEG. The new Shots was a game changer. Every cell had its own toilet and shower, fixing the old complaints about privacy. A 2013 BBC report even called the accommodation some of the best in Scotland's prison system. The NIC kept its role, helping cons ease into long sentences, whilst the SRU dealt with the toughest cases. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. A 2022 inspection flagged staff shortages, dodgy patient care, and a whole load of drugs, showing that the new build couldn't have fixed everything. Shots has been in the papers for all sorts. Some pure grim, and some showing a bit of heart. Here's a deep dive into the biggest stories that put Shots in the spotlight. One of them being the attack of Stuart Sproul. It was around 8 in the morning, and a standard morning in Shots. Officer Stuart Sproul was doing his rounds, opening security gates in the main hall. The CCTV shows Thomas Stevenson, a 30-year-old con walking up to him. Before you know it, Stevenson whips out a blade and rips the dial right off him. At first it just looked like a punch on camera, but within seconds the blood is gushing out his cutin. Stevenson gets the boot down, runs down the corridor and stashes the blade, but it gets grabbed quite quickly, surprisingly. The place gets locked down right away. Sproul's kicking about with his face hanging off him, and he was left with an 8cm gash. Sproul gets rushed out to the hospital, his face hanging open like a horror film. Police Scotland get to shots sharpish, and Stevenson is reported to the Procurator Fiscal. For what I hear, Stuart Sproul was actually one of the better screws, so I've been told. So why did he get attacked? This leads us back to Thomas Stevenson, right? Who actually was Thomas Stevenson? Stevenson wasn't your typical con, right? He was sentenced to 6 years for assault and robbery down in Ayrshire. He had a long history with mental health issues, paranoid schizophrenia being a massive one, and that was tied back to a weed habit stretching back to his teens. Before he was in shots, he was bounced around psychiatric wards, including Carstairs, which is Scotland's maximum security mental hospital. But just 8 weeks before attacking Stuart, Stevenson gets shifted from Carstairs to shots. The doctors said he was stable enough, but he clearly wasn't. But it seemed he was too mad for shots. In June 2017, Stevenson faced Hamilton Sheriff Court and pled guilty to the slashing. The CCTV footage was played to a silent court, showing the attack. Because Stevenson's mental health history, Sheriff Ray Small handed down a restriction and compulsion order. This wasn't traditional jail time. Stevenson was to be locked up indefinitely at Carstairs. Right back up the road, the Screws Union, POAS, was absolutely raging. They said Stevenson should never have been at shots to start with, and the move for Carstairs to a mainstream jail had been a terrible decision. But what happened to Sproul wasn't an isolated case. Violence in Scottish jails was getting worse in that time, and Glenochil and our Screw get slashed just a few months earlier. At shots itself, cons were regularly stabbing and slashing each other. Violence was up everywhere, especially against female screws, with numbers doubling in recent years. The slashing of Stuart Sproul was a shocking, brutal attack. It revealed deep problems behind Scotland's prison laws. A screw disfigured and a violent nutter wrongly placed in a system forced to face hard truths. But in the end, one thing was clear. Jails like shots aren't a joke. On the 8th of August 2020, Kurt McIntyre, a lifer, went off his hidden shots. He battered fellow con Scott Fowler with a pool cue and leaving him a mess with a broken nose and cuts all over his head. The CCTV caught McIntyre, who was 54 at the time, walking into the cell and leaving 2 minutes later, with Fowler staggering out after. McIntyre clearly denied it, but Hamilton Sheriff Court wasn't having it, and they smacked on an extra 3 years on his 20-year minimum sentence. Fowler tried to say he was high on illegal drugs and fell, but the evidence pointed straight at McIntyre. Unfortunately, McIntyre's story ended in tragedy. He died in shots on April 25th, 2025, aged 56, triggering a fatal accident inquiry. Today, HMP Shot stands as Scotland's only jail solely for long-term adult male prisoners, holding them serving 5 years or more, with many doing life sentences. It's a maximum security fortress with double perimeter fences, extensive CCTV and strict controls. But there's a growing focus on giving inmates a chance to change. The prison offers education, from basic literacy to vocational courses, and mental health support to help people prep for life outside. Recent programmes like drama workshops, where cons write scripts about the justice system, aim to cut re-offending, beginning a creative outlet. The family centre run by Get Better Together is a standout, making visits less daunting, especially for the Waynes. Around 1,600 visitors come monthly in the centre. The only one behind Shot Secure Line helps keep family ties strong, which is key for reducing re-offending. Sacro's bus service for Glasgow twice a month makes it easier for families to get there. But it's not a walk in the park. A 2022 inspection report painted a grim picture. Staff shortages were hitting healthcare, training and evening activities hard. Patient care get a poor rating, with no GP cover from 1:30pm to 6pm. No doctors in the afternoon. A pilot survey was even more worrying. 46% of prisoners said they'd seen staff abusing or bullying inmates. 77% thought the complaint system was rubbish, and 49% didn't know how to reach an independent prison monitor. Drugs are a massive problem too, with a high incidence of substance issues for your intention. But despite these hurdles, Shotts keeps pushing forward. The NIC continues to guide long-termers, while initiatives like Wee Dogs Wednesday and dementia awareness show a commitment to well-being. It's a place of contrast, locking up the worst of the worst, but trying to make them better, apparently. From its gritty beginnings in 1978 to its sleek rebuild in 2012, Shotts has been a mirror of Scotland's prison system. Tough, troubled, but trying to change. Its history is packed with dark moments, like violent attacks and corruption. But moving on to a more relaxed setting, we visit a place that's not just a nick, but a living piece of Scotland's soul. This isn't just your usual jail. Think of a castle rising from a rocky outcrop, built when knights were still swinging swords. It's the only open prison in Scotland, giving cons a shot at redemption. But what started as a fortress in 1452 became a housing block for low-risk cons. It's not just cons that are running about, there's also been sightings of a ghost. The ghost of HMP Castle Huntley. In 1452, Lord Grey of Fowlis, a noble with a knack for survival, gets a nod for King James II to build a castle. He picks a volcanic rock in the Carse of Gowrie, surrounded by marshy wilderness. Perfect for keeping enemies at bay. Using stone for King Goody Quarry, he raises a castle with an L-shaped tower, 5 flares high, with battlements but no turrets. It was a fortress meant to scream power and protection. For over a century, the Greys held the castle. By 1508, records show it had a tower and a fortalice, proper stronghold essentially. But in 1614, the 7th Lord Grey, caught up in the messy politics of James VI's minority, sells it to Patrick Lyon, Earl of Kinghorn. He slaps a new name on it, Castle Lyon, and brings in painters like Apollyon Akicius and a Mrs Morris to spruce the place up in the late 1600s. Fast forward to the 1770s, and the widow of the 7th Earl of Strathmore punts it to a guy called George Patterson, a big shot for the East India Company. Patterson renames it Castle Huntley and gives it a modern makeover, adding wings and polishing the old stone. It stays with the Pattersons until 1946, when Gordon Patterson eventually snuffs it. His missus sells it to the government. But why did the government want an old castle? In 1947, the government turns Castle Huntley into a borstal, a place to straighten out young offenders with hard work and discipline. It was a bold move, taking a medieval fortress and making it a school for wayward boys. By the 1970s, it's a YOs. And in 1984, it becomes Scotland's only open prison for adult males. An open prison basically means low-risk cons that are trusted to behave, get to work outside, learn trades and prep for life beyond the bars. The SPS says it's all about careful preparation for release, with activities focusing on enhanced personal responsibility, job readiness and positive citizenship. Sounds a lot like a progressive approach to rehabilitation, doesn't it? But was it effective? Well, in 2022, inspectors rocked up to Castle Huntley and they weren't happy. Why? Because the place can hold 285 cons, but only 100 were there. They call it a disappointing underuse and said HMP Castle Huntley should be a flagship establishment of the SPS. They even hinted at closing it if things didn't pick up. But they couldn't deny its inspiring and restorative tranquility. That was a nod to its serene setting. The SPS clapped back, saying they welcomed the report. They'd boosted numbers by 25% since April and put a senior leader on the case to sort it out. As if you needed a prison inspector to state the obvious. Chief Inspector David Strang was quoted saying, "Relationships between staff and prisoners are mutually respectful and amicable." I've heard different. In fact, to the contrary, I've heard the cons had their access to freedom used against them. Step in the wrong side of the screws and you'll get the right end of a downgrade. It's held against you. And I know many people that's told me that same story. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be good ones and bad ones on both sides. It's as simple as that. But in other news, I promised a ghost and a ghost still deliver. This is the story of the White Lady of Castle Huntley. But imagine it, right? It's the 17th century and Castle Lyon, as it was called then, is a grand fortress owned by the Lyon family. A young daughter of the house gets caught pumping a manservant, essentially. And in they days, that wasn't just a scandal, it was sin. It was a clash of class. When her family found out, they dragged her away, locked her up in a tower in the castle's battlements, and left her to rot. The young lady, unable to endure her suffering, climbed to the edge of the battlements and threw herself to her death. That's the story, at least. It's told by people who have kept it alive for centuries. But death wasn't the end for her. Early years, the White Lady's been seen by all sorts. Locals, cons, even screws at Castle Huntley. Apparently she kicked about the jail at night, kicking about in white robes. Some people say she's actually been seen in the very room that she was imprisoned. The prison phone website puts it plainly, right? They say the castle was to be haunted by the quote-unquote White Lady, a young woman dressed in white robes. Her ghost is reportedly been seen in the castle grounds at night. It does not seem to cause fear and appears harmless. Another source, Unexplained Mysteries, says she's been seen a number of times over the years, often in the grounds surrounding the castle, and even in the room where she was locked away. A Flickr photo description echoes this, noticing that she's been seen in her white robes, haunting the grounds in her prison room. But here's the thing, right? Whilst these stories are quite widespread, specific names of people that have seen her are kind of hard to come by. It's not like diaries, no letters, no sworn statements. But still, the story is that consistent across sources that it's very clear that she's got a big part of the castle's history. But another thing that Castle Huntley will probably go down in Scottish prison history for is something that you've probably picked up on as I've went through this podcast, and as I continue, you'll notice the same problems pop up. Staffing issues, an inability to cope with the demand, too many prisoners, overcrowding. That's all happening everywhere, except for Castle Huntley. Castle Huntley's not experiencing overcrowding. They're actually experiencing undercrowding. Why? That's because, as I mentioned, if you watched the Low Moss segment, where I was talking about people not being progressed forward, progression isn't big in the Scottish prison system. You need to work hard to get it. There's a backlog as such, and you're always getting flung to the bottom of the pile. You get given a set date. They call it a date of progression. At this point in your sentence, you can progress forward to open estate. If you're a long-termer or a lifer, you need to go to Castle Huntley to get parole. Maybe not so much a long-termer, right? But you need to be getting community access. Especially in Polmont. I was in Polmont. We couldn't go to the Castle Huntley. But trying to get progressed for homeleys, work placements, SELs, which is supervised escorted leave. You're taken out to the house by screws, but you're no handcuffed. All these things, very, very difficult to get to. Very difficult. They're looking for every reason to knock you back. And the screws that work in these halls, they use it against you. So you've got this guy talking about the relationship's been quite healthy. You would be saying that, mate. Relationships between staff and cons are healthy. Aye, if you ask them. That's the thing is, cons aren't going to tell you that because they'll get downgraded. It's a weapon that's wielded against you. And it seems Castle Huntley solved the overcrowding problem. The fact is that nobody gets sent there for it to get overcrowded. This is due to people not being progressed. So, progression aside, right, Castle Huntley is a rich history. Although very different from our previous contenders, it still plays a massive role in the prison system's legacy, offering long-termers that doorway back into society. But that's if they can get near it. Although Castle Huntley wasn't the only open prison in Scotland's history, it's also worth mentioning another open jail that also operated in Dundee for a bit of time. 2 open jails in Dundee. Just shows you Dundonians can't hack the time, eh? This is a story of HMP Northside. Northside's story starts in 1963 when the SPS turned a slice of Angus into a Borstal for YOs. At its heart was Northside House, a B-listed classical mansion built in 1766, once home to wealthy landowners with stables and massive grun. The SPS came in and added cell blocks, farm buildings and workshops, transforming the estate into an open prison with a capacity of up to 140 cons. It was designed to serve YOs aged 16 to 20 and low-risk adults, offering a less restrictive path to reintegration. By the 80s, it had shifted to an adult open prison. but its roots were in giving young cons a second chance. But was this country manor a fresh start, or just a fancy cage? Let's find out. The Orange Sides regime was all about work and responsibility. The open prison way. YOs and low-risk cons, them serving 18 months to life but deemed low risk, spent their days in fields or workshops doing farm work, horticulture or trades like woodwork. The goal was to build skills and trust for release. Cells were basic but less grim. Some single, some shared, with access to toilets and minimal lock-up time. Look, the cons could kick about during the day, but there was dub-ups and curfews and that kept in the check. Education was quite patchy, basic literacy or vocational. With less screws than May's high security nicks, the regime relied on the cons' good behaviour, and the rural isolation helped keep escapes low. Northern Side's incident log is light, but it's no clean. It's open set-up, no high fences, made escapes a risk. In 2009, a YO legged it during a work placement, sparking a manhunt and exposing the regime's weak spots. It was caught quite quickly, but it rattled the SPS. There was wee scuffles and a bit of rule breaking like smuggling booze. Aid would pop up here and there, but no riots or major violence hit the news. The bigger issue was isolation. The jail's remote location, miles for towns or families, left cons feeling cut off. Was the calm a blessing, or was it a silent curse? Northern Side functioned as Scotland's only open prison for YOs, alongside low-risk adults, taking in people for tougher nicks like Polmont. With a capacity of 140, it focused on rehabilitation through work and community ties, prepping cons for release. Some of them even done supervised community work, which was a bridge to the outside. The SPS saw it as a key part of their reoffending reduction plan, but the rural setting made family visits tough, hindering reintegration. Did the regime set cons free, or were they kept in limbo? Northside shut its gates in October 30th, 2011. It merged with HMP Castle Huntley. It's only 20 miles away. The SPS blamed a drop in prisoners meeting open prison criteria, making Northside surplus. Running a small remote jail was costly, and it couldn't house other prisoner types without big upgrades. Cons were shipped off to Castle Huntley, and by 2014, Angus Council approved plans to turn the site into 48 houses, keeping Northside House but raising the prison bits. Unions fought the closure, but the SPS stood their ground. Was this a smart move, or was it a kick in the balls of the YO? As we keep unravelling Scotland's history, Northside's a reminder of what could have been. But it's fair to say we've absolutely rinsed, for the most part, the prison system that's responsible for locking up the guys. But now we're going to change tact and venture into an establishment that catered for the opposite gender, steeped in a very deep history of its own. This is the story of HMP Cornton Vale. From its opening in 1975 to its shutdown in 2023, this jail has got some stories to tell. But how did a prison meant to reform turn into a nightmare? It's 1975 and Scotland's got a problem. The number of women getting locked up is climbing, and there's no proper place to put them. The SPS decide to build HMP Cornton Vale in Stirling, which is a national hub for lady prisoners. Lady Martha Bruce, the first governor, takes the helm, overseeing a complex with 217 cells across 5 blocks. The plan? To centralise convicted women and YOs, give them structure and maybe a chance to turn things round. By 1978, new laws let remand prisoners in and all, so it's meant to be a fresh start, a place to punish and rehabilitate. Former Lord Advocate Eilish Angelini later said prisons exist to punish and rehabilitate, but too often when women are in prison for low-level offences, it does merit to punish the families left on the outside. I can't help but agree. But was Cornton Vale ever fit for purpose? I think you realise where I go with these, eh? When Cornton Vale opened, it was a bold move. You had 4 blocks with 178 spots, right? Each split into wee units with dining rooms and kitchens, plus a 5th block for the YOs. The idea was to create a community feel, not just a cage. In 2004, they even tried letting Waynes up to stay with their ma's, and this was an approach to try and keep families together. But cracks started to show quite early. By the 1990s, shock horror, the jail was bulging. 340 inmates in 2004 against a capacity of 230. Clive Fairweather, Chief Inspector in 1999, begged for the population to be cut to 100, said it wasn't right for women with mental health and addiction issues. But was this only the start of the trouble? Overcrowding led to really grim conditions. You had 2 hour waits for the toilet, called scran, and boredom that would crush your soul. Brigadier Hugh Monroe, who was the Chief Inspector in 2010, called it a state of crisis, saying the atmosphere of boredom in the prison created an environment that lent itself to re-offending. Violence was rampant. Between 2006 and 2011, the jail racked up 489 assaults and 664 fights, higher per prisoner than even Barlinnie. James Kelly, Scottish Labour's Shadow Justice Minister, said, "These are worrying statistics, and it's important to understand what lies behind the level of reported assaults. Women, often damaged by trauma or addiction, turn to violence as a way of life." Bill White, a criminal justice expert, put it bluntly, prisoners at Cornton Vale tend to be the most damaged individuals in prison or elsewhere, and for some of them, violence is a lifelong means of communication. But the violence wasn't the worst of it. You see, Cornton Vale's darkest stain was its suicide rate. Between 1995 and 2002, 11 women took their own lives, 8 by hanging from 1995 to 1998 alone. 2 died in a single week in 2001. The 2012 Angelini Commission report painted a grim picture. Cornton Vale is a miserable place with conditions antediluvian and appalling. By the way, antediluvian basically means prehistoric. Fucking snob. In 2019, inspectors found women in desperate need of psychiatric care. One woman bit through her arm to the bone. Another one set her hair on fire. Stephanie Ritchie, a former prisoner, told STV News the conditions at Cornton Vale were terrible. "I remember the building was sinking and we were lying in our beds and you could smell the sewage. It was disgusting. We were treated like animals." The governor in 2006 admitted, "I'm shocked by the high numbers of mentally ill people we need to deal with." But the scandals kept coming. Escapes and breaches made headlines. In 2014, Amy Stewart, jailed for a murder, did a runner after a week-long licence and never returned. Kaylee Murray, convicted of killing a man with one punch, was let out for a date with her jailbird fiancé in 2016. As you can imagine, the public kicked off. Kim Gray, that stabbed a taxi driver, got a day trip to watch 50 Shades of Grey in 2015. Apparently her victim was raging about it. He said, "I'm absolutely disgusted." Probably the biggest scandal in Scottish prison history hit Cornton Vale, and it wasn't a riot, hostage taking, or a grand escape. It was 2 words. Isla Bryson. In 2023, Cornton Vale hit the news when trans rapist Isla Bryson was papped there. It kicked off massively. There was protests outside the jail, with Rape Crisis Scotland tweeting it is not appropriate for somebody convicted of any serious sexual offence to be placed within the general female population. Nicola Sturgeon stepped in, saying Bryson wouldn't stay at Cornton Vale either short term or long term. Days after being sent to Cornton Vale, Bryson was carted off to HMP Stockton. On the guys' wing, the move came after a court warrant pushing for HMP Barlinnie, a men's prison, was ignored by the SPS, which had people saying that the order to send Bryson to Cornton Vale must have came from the highest level. And this didn't just get brushed under the carpet. It actually lit a fuse under the whole debate about trans prisoners and gender self-ID policies. By February 28, 2023, Bryson got an 8-year sentence for the rapes and a 3 year of supervision post-release and a lifelong spot in the sex offenders register. Get it up, ye. Lord Scott, the judge, told Bryson, "You see yourself as the victim in this case, but you're no, pointing out his high risk of re-offending and his targeting of vulnerable women." The trial heard Bryson, who transitioned whilst awaiting trial, claimed he'd known he was trans since aged 4, but his estranged wife, Shona Graham, called it a sham for attention to dodge a guy's jail. The SPS, still scunnered for the scandal, rolled out a new policy saying trans prisoners would be housed based on their birth sex until a case-by-case assessment deemed otherwise. This was a direct fallout for Bryson's case, with the SPS review claiming he'd no contact with other prisoners at Cornton Vale and posed no risk there, although they kept the full report under wraps, citing personal details. People like Russell Finlay weren't having it, demanding that the report be published to clear up why a double rapist ever set foot in a woman's jail. By 2024, Bryson was still stirring the pot for inside HMP Stockton, whinging about being misgendered by the prison staff and claiming to be a victim of transphobia. He wrote to the Sunday Mail, moaning about a female screw calling him son and the lack of female toiletries, even bragging about relationships with other cons, including a convicted nonce. Former Cornton Vale Governor Rona Hotchkiss laughed off Bryson's hate crime claims, saying misgendering wasn't a crime, and pointing to Humza Yousaf's own words that Bryson was quote unquote at it. Apparently a leaked document to Police Scotland for October 2024 showed that they actually considered recording Bryson as a female in the sex offenders register, but Chief Constable Joe Farrell shut it down, saying that rape is a crime only a man can commit under Scots law. So in the end, Bryson's case didn't just shift prison policy, it became a lightning rod for the gender reform debate. Nicola Sturgeon's self-ID bill, already in shaky ground, took a bit of a battering. You had people like Douglas Ross and women's rights groups hammering home the risks of opportunistic transitions. Bryson is still in the jail, serving his time in a man's prison. But the Ripple Face case keeps churning, with people like Finlay warning they'll be back in the street by 2027. It's a prospect no much comfort to the victims. The whole mess left a big mark, exposing cracks in the system and fueling a fierce debate that's still going on. But it was long before this scandal that Cornton Vale had started to show cracks. In 2012, the Angelini report demanded Cornton Vale be demolished, calling for a smaller jail and regional units. They had plans for HMP Inverclyde, but they fell to the wayside, and instead HMP in YY Stirling was built next door for $85 million. That opened in July 2023. Cornton Vale shut its doors in April 2023, and its inmates moved to Stirling's trauma-informed setup. Theresa Medhurst, the SPF Chief Executive, said, "This is significant development. It will help give women in our care the best possible chance of a successful rehabilitation." But people like Natalie Logan, shout out Natalie, for Cisco, warned that community through care is missing. There is a lack of communication between establishments and the community. HMP Stirling was plopped in the same site with a mission to fix the mess. The plan was an £85.7 million women's national facility that's smaller, sleeker, and all about healing rather than punishing. It's got room for just 100 lassies compared to the Cornton Vale's 400 plus, and it's designed with a trauma-informed vibe. No bars and windies, no cell doors, just a campus-style setup with views of Stirling Castle and the Ochil Hills. When I say no cell doors, I mean no clanky, bangy cell doors. Not too bad, eh? But here's the thing. This shiny new jail, right, was meant to be open in 2020, but it got kind of delayed because of the pandemic, with costs for bricks and mortar shooting up, right? So by the time it finally opened in 2023, it was 2 years late and £7 million over budget. The Tories, of course, were having kittens. Russell Finlay started greeting that the SNP aren't interested in justice and taxpayers were left holding the bill. But the SPS were buzzing, and you had Chief Theresa Medhurst boasting it unlocked potential and transformed lives. It took yous long enough. But would this fancy jail live up to the hype, or was it just a pricey pipe dream? So HMP Stirling's got this big idea, right? To stop the revolving door of crime by focusing on the lassie's mental health and past traumas. Brilliant, I'm all for it. Most women in the nick have had a rough go. 98% at Cornton Vale had addiction issues, 80% had mental health struggles, and 75% were survivors of abuse. Stirling's meant to be different. It's got a mother and baby unit, an enhanced mental health area, and a separation and reintegration unit for the trickier cases. The SPS's Alistair Purdy was over the moon, telling BBC Scotland our staff can now focus on individual needs, wanting to break that cycle of offending. It's got like wee hussies called Primrose, Bluebell and Thistle, with shared kitchen and gardens, making it feel less like a jail and more like a therapeutic retreat. Early signs were promising. Justice Secretary Angela Constance called it world leading, saying that a smaller setup and mental health support would slash the offending rates. The design by Holmes Miller, a bit of alright, with big windies and views to calm the soul. It took inspiration for ideas for the posh Scandinavian jails. But here's the thing, right? It's only been open since 2023, so hard numbers on rehabilitation, they're a bit sketchy. The SPS claimed they're transforming lives. But with no long-term data, some people just think it's too soon to be calling it a win going up the road, know what I mean? But there was also some people that weren't that happy about the opening of HMP Stirling. And that was the neighbours. Locals in Forth Park and Vale Grove, living right next to the jail, were going to have their nut. They were moaning about screaming, shouting, swearing and banging for the jail at all hours. It turns out the separation and reintegration unit, where the most mental and violent lasses are kept, was built right next to a housing estate. According to HM Inspector Wendy Sinclair Gibbon, it was a quote-unquote major design flaw. That's one way to put it. People were shutting their windows and wearing noise-cancelling headphones to cope with the racket. Somebody told the BBC, "My two Waynes shouldn't be hearing all that foul language and aggro." MSP Alexander Stewart was raging, writing to Angela Constance to sort it out. The SPS promised to fix it, but the papers lapped it up, with headlines like £85 million super jails, noisy nightmare. It's a lot of money to spend on a shite sleep, innit? Whilst HMP Stirling's grabbing the headlines, something a bit quieter's happening during Glasgow at the Lilith Centre, one of Scotland's first community custody units. So this was opened in 2022, alongside the Bella Centre in Dundee. The Lilith Centre is a game changer for low-risk women nearing release. It's just like a wee unit with 24 beds. It's designed to feel more like a house rather than a jail, and it's got shared living spaces and no bars. The SPS's strategy for women in custody, launched in 2022, says it's all about building relationships and preparing women for life outside. Theresa Medhurst told the Daily Record, "These CCUs give women the best possible chance at a safe return to their communities. Unlike Cornton Vale's dodgy, overcrowded cells, or even Stirling's posh but still secure setup, Lilith is about freedom with guardrails. Lassies get to cook their own scran, manage their own schedules, and work with social workers to sort out jobs or housing. It's mainly built for women that have experienced trauma, which is near enough all of them. It takes ideas from places like New Zealand and Canada." Keith Brown, then Justice Secretary, bragged to the SPS website that the CCUs are a step change in how Scotland supports women in custody. Early signs are good. The SPS say women leaving Lilith are less likely to re-offend, although again, it's a bit too soon, unless you've got the stats. But there's a catch. Back to Natalie Logan again, shout out Natalie. Told STV News, "Having these new places is great, but how do we have enough support outside to keep these women on track?" You see, if the community can't catch them when they're out, will Lily just be a nice holiday before they're back in the nick? And what's next for Scotland's prison system? From suicides to scandals, the true cost of locking up Scotland's most broken women. As Bill White said, "We are failing these women and we're failing the community." Now, with Stirling taking air, there is hope for change, but will it break the cycle, or is it just another chapter in a never-ending story? There has been a lot less women's prisons built in Scotland. Their history is just as interesting. One recurring theme is a battle between the prisoners and the SPS, a custodial tug-of-war all throughout history. But the SPS aren't the only corporation that runs Scottish jails. Next up, we're looking at two jails in Scotland that are ran by private organisations. Well, at least one of them are now. Each have got their own stories of chaos and criminality, inhabited by some of the tastiest characters in the prison system. The first of its kind, we're going to head down to Beauhouse and tell the story of HMP Kilmarnock. Enter HMP Kilmarnock. Flung up in Beauhouse, 3 miles from Hurlford, opened on the 25th of March 1999 by Premier Prison Services, who got nabbed by Serco in 2002. This was Scotland's first privately run nick, built to hold 500 cons, remand, short-term, long-term and YOs, with a max capacity of 692. What was the deal? It was a 25-year contract with Kilmarnock Prison Services Limited, costing a whopping $368 million by the end of it. Serco's Mark Whittaker told Facilitate magazine Killy's been the most cost-effective prison in the Scottish estate. But what's the real price? The place was brand new, with single cells, proper toilets. This was during the slopping out era, so this was big time. It had quite a clean setup, according to a 2005 HMIPS report. But being private meant it was all about outputs, meet the targets, keep the heat down, and don't make a mess. The SPS kept an eye on Serco, but they didn't tell them how to spend their cash, which led to some raised eyebrows like that. However, it was 2005 where Kilmarnock would see its shortcomings exposed in a national platform for the country to see, at the hands of BBC's Panorama crew, who went undercover with hidden cameras and reporters pretending to be staff. Jesus, Donald McIntyre, eat your heart out, man. Panorama's expose titled Private Prisons, Profit and Loss put a few private noses out of joint. The undercover footage showed HMP Kilmarnock stretched thinner than a roll of cling film. Staff shortages are a big one. Surprise, surprise. There's barely enough screws to keep the place under control, with reports of low staff to prisoner ratios making it a nightmare to manage the cons. The programme catches staff cutting corners and neglecting security checks. There's even talk of a culture where profit comes before safety, with Serco accused of prioritising their bank balance of proper training and resources. The public were speechless, and the papers went bush. You get headlines talking about a national disgrace and private prison failures. MSPs obviously jumped in the bandwagon, and you had the Scottish Parliament's Justice Committee booting Serco right up the haw-maws. The Prison Officers Association, already scunnered with private jails, used it as ammo to push for Kilmarnock to go public. Serco was scrambling, promising internal reviews and robust action to fix the mess. Too little too late, because the damage was already done. HMP Kilmarnock's shiny white Calvin classics were now skid-marked and piss-stained. But what made Kelly stand out for other Scottish jails? Unlike your bog-standard SPS jails like Barlinnie or Peterhead, HMP Kilmarnock was a private beast for 25 years. It was run like a business. That meant innovations like ATMs and in-cell phones for the cons. These were a first in Scotland. They also had a family and friends hub to make visits less of a nightmare, something other jails were quite slow to copy. And apparently the staff to prisoner vibe was decent and all. However, we consult a report here by the HMIPS saying that positive interactions made Killie safer than it was, with no serious staff down since 2004 and con-on-con violence dropping steep since 2003. But that was until one of the most notable incidents of violence occurred in February 2013, where a serious gym assault made the headlines. The assault of Imran Baldi Shahid. It's February 12, 2013 at HMP Kilmarnock, and the cons are buzzing, right, because Celtic's playing Juventus in the Champions League. Most of the hall's watching the telly, but in the gym, something mental's about to kick off. See, Imran Baldi Shahid was a 36-year-old caged for the murder of 15-year-old Chris Donald. He's on their own machine giving it loudy, right? Apparently he's been flinging his weight about, bullying people, doing things like apparently making people peel his oranges so he doesn't get his horns sticky, launching people's clays off the railings in the tap landing that they're drying them, stuff like that, just putting a pure dick. But tonight, the tables are about to turn. There was a squad of cons led by convicted murderer Willie Crawford. Had been planning this for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment when the screws were distracted. With only 2 screws watching their 20 cons in the gym, they chose their moment. And his moment he did pick. At 8:17 PM, Crawford picked up a 15-kilo weight and smashed it into the back of Baldy's skull, knocked him right off their own machine. CCTV was later splashed all across the Daily Record, showing the whole thing lasting just 23 seconds. But it was 23 seconds of pure madness. You've got Crawford, he flings the weight in Shahid's chest, he stamps on him, and then a few other cons get involved and join in and start battering him with metal bars and kicking his face and body. There was actually one guy called Bernard Bissett who was trying to back up Shahid, and he runs in, but he ends up getting a doing and all. There's blood pooling up in the flare, and Shahid is left with a fractured jaw, cheekbone, shattered teeth, and spinal injuries. The doctor said only his extreme muscular build saved him from dying, according to Kilmarnock Sheriff Court. The papers went mental. The Daily Record screamed race hate killer Imran Baldi Shahid left for dead in prison gym attack, and it showed the CCTV frame by frame. A source told the Record some cons had made it clear they didn't want Shahid there. He was a hate figure when they arrived. But why? That's because Shahid was the ringleader of a gang that kidnapped, stabbed and burned Chris Donald alive just because he was white. Scotland's first racially motivated murder conviction. People inside and out hated him for it. The attack wasn't just a scrap, it was a message. But what happened to the guys that actually done the damage? You see, the gym bashing wasn't just a one and done type thing. 8 cons aged 22 to 44 were reported to the PF for attempted murder, according to the Daily Record. The main guy, Crawford, got an extra 4 years on top of his 18-year life sentence. Brian Hislop get 3 year and 9 month added, and Darren Watson get 3 year after they pled guilty to the assault. The court heard it was meticulously planned and took advantage of the fact the Celtic game was on because it caught the Screws off guard, and apparently the Cons were high-fiving Crawford as he left the gym. Shahid, meanwhile, was carted to Crosshouse Hospital wearing a neck brace for 12 weeks and stuck in isolation ever since. Apparently at one point Baldy phoned the Daily Record and told them he was fucking ripped and promising revenge, but was apparently now a broken man according to insiders. But the story didn't end there. How did this rammy ripple through Kilmarnock and beyond? You see, the Shahid assault put HMP Kilmarnock's rep as a safe private nick under the microscope. Serco, who ran the place, get pelters for the low staff to prisoner ratio. You had 2 screws for 20 cons in a gym. A spokeswoman told the Daily Record there was no plans to review the staff to prisoner ratio, claiming it met stringent safety and security requirements. But people weren't buying it. You see, the situation fed into a wider narrative of trouble at Kilmarnock, which included a riot over mail. It's Saturday the 10th of August 2019, and the protection ring came to about 60 cons, people at sex offenders or people who needed kept away from the main population for their own safety. It's meant to be a quiet bit of the jail, but the night, it's about to kick off. The trouble starts right when the Screws decide to hold back the cons' mail. Why? Because they've got intel that criminal gangs are smuggling drugs into the jail by soaking letters in liquid gear, like synthetic cannabinoids or other substances known as spice. The cons expecting their mail are raging when it doesn't turn up. By 6 o'clock, what starts off as a peaceful protest turns into a full-scale riot. Around 40 to 60 cons, the numbers are a bit sketchy, refuse to go behind their door, and they end up taking control of the hall and then just setting up camp for the night. Things go from bad to just pure mental in no time. So the cons are now running the place. They start ripping it apart. You get toilets and washing facilities ripped off the wall, and the cons are just flinging bits of ceramic, buckets of hot water, and even a pool table at security gates to keep the screws out. One con called Lee Neil McClellan is seen in CCTV pushing a pool table and a table tennis table against a gate, and then he flings a mattress to block the door. Another guy called Nicholas the Pellet is caught flinging broken ceramic and acting aggressive toward the staff. The Screws, outnumbered and overwhelmed, retreat to the central hub, lock the gates and leave the hall in the hands of the rioters. Serco calls in the big guns, specialist tornado squads, trained for prison riots. Off-duty Screws are dragged in to help. By 9:45 the hall's a war zone. You've got cons chanting, smashing and flinging whatever they can find. It takes until 20 past 10 at night for the riot crew to run in the hall and start locking people back in their cells. 2 cons get minor injuries and the wing is upside down. By Sunday the 11th of August, the riot is there and HMP Kilmarnock's on lockdown to keep a lid on things. A few ringleaders get papped out to other jails like Barlinnie or Low Moss to split everybody up. The jail's hoping to get back to normal by Sunday night, but the damage is already done. The protection ring is an absolute midden. You've got smashed up toilets, smashed furniture, and a cunty a repair bill. Serco's Michael Guy, the prison director, calls it an incident of concerted indiscipline and says it was successfully brought under control with no major injuries. But the papers are all at it, with the Scottish Sun and the Daily Record writing headlines about riots and drug crackdowns. The situation feeds into the wider narrative of trouble at Kilmarnock, with people pointing fingers at Serco's private model. Low staff ratios, cut corners, and a jail system that is just shaking under the pressure. In 2022, McClelland and Deplet cop it in Kilmarnock Sheriff Court, admitting to threatening behaviour and facing extra time. Sheriff McTaggart didn't mess about. He called Lee Neil McClelland's behaviour absolutely dreadful. He gets slapped with a 21-month custodial sentence, just for 2 years because he pled to it. He was banged to rights anyway. He was caught on CCTV pushing the pool table and TT table against a gate. He actually started shouting "fuck the system" in the dock and punching the air, which probably didn't do him any favours. And Nicholas de Perla, whose address was listed as Montrose, he got a different deal. He was seen CCTV acting aggressive and throwing broken bits of ceramic towards the end of the riot, trying to stop the Screws getting in. Instead of a straight jail sentence, he gets sentenced deferred to a later date for a restriction of liberty order assessment and social work reports. And this was partly because he was accidentally shipped to Forfar Sheriff Court by mistaking the day, so the court couldn't sentence him right away. No final sentences confirmed in sources, so we're kinda left in limbo on where to go. The fact that it was deferred kinda suggests that it was probably community service at Otago. Another jail, another riot, different postcode, same story. There's one very unique tale to be told about Kilmarnock, and it occurred during the COVID lockdown. It's spring 2020, and HMP Kilmarnock's like a kebab shop on a Saturday night, packed and stinking. COVID's running amok, and Serco's arse is making buttons. 2 cons have already tested positive, and many more are locked in their cells, isolating. By 2021, nearly 300 folk, cons and staff catch the virus, and one guy even get carted off to the hospital. The screws are running about trying to enforce social distance in a jail where you can barely swing a canteen sheet. Testing is a shambles. Masks are few. The whole place is one sneeze away for an all-out meltdown. So whilst the jail's turned into 28 days later, 14 screws decide to head into the car park outside the jail. And what do? They start dancing. And how do we know this? Because they posted it on TikTok. This wasn't just a couple of here we goes and a few shoulder tackles. This was a full-on choreographed routine. Diversity would have been prouder. A source at the jail told the Daily Record it's a much needed lift for people stuck working in such grim conditions. And STV News says it's all about showing love for frontline workers. Meanwhile, the custard in the hot plate has got a skin like a Siamese cat. Whilst these fannies are doing the Gangnam style out the front. Come March 17, 2024, HMP Kilmarnock officially waves bye-bye to Serco and becomes a public prison again. SPS boss Theresa Medhurst calls it a unique and momentous responsibility. She's no kidding. They've got to transfer 300 odd staff, update every system for payroll to security cameras, and make sure the 500 cons don't kick off in the meantime. The jail's in decent nick. There's no leaky roofs or busted pipes or skint custard. But Serco's left some gaps, like no proper through care support officers to help cons get back on their feet after release. The SPS keeps the good bits, like the family and friends hubs for visitors, and no fancy body-worn cameras for screws. But they're under pressure to prove public control can outshine the private shambles. The POA's chuffed, been campaigning for this since day one, and the papers are buzzing with headlines about the end of private jails in Scotland. It's a big win, but the real test is keeping the jail running smooth. As 2024 rolls in, HMP Kilmarnock settled into its new life as an SPS prison. The handover is hailed as a success, with the SPS going on about the jail's strong community links and well-managed vibe. But we never forget the days of panorama, riots and car park choreographic dancing. Seriously, you can shower our fannies. HMP Kilmarnock's had its fair share of dramas, troops, right? But it's not the only private jail in Scotland that's been keeping the tabloids busy. In fact, almost placed second best to our next contestant, a headline stealer out in West Lothian. This nick, ran by Sodexo since it opened in 2008, is meant to be a shiny learning prison for turning cons into model citizens. But it's been more like a masterclass in mayhem. For sky-high self-harm rates, 11,139 in 5 years, the highest in Scotland, to a series of deaths in custody, including 10 between 2018 to 2023. The papers went mental with staff shortages, with reports of screws being too scared to patrol the halls alone, with cons smashed up a unit with dodgy conditions. And here's the money shot. Sodexo paid out £3 million to shareholders in 2022, whilst the safety fears piled up, leaving MSPs and unions raging. Kilmarnock's 2005 panorama set up, 2019 riot and TikTok dancing had your interest, then this place will certainly have your attention. Up next is the West Lothian madhouse that is HMP Addiewell. It's the 1860s, and the site where HMP Addiewell now sits, in the wee village of Addiewell, West Lothian, is a steaming industrial shithole. Back then, it's the Addiewell Chemical Works, churning out paraffin oil for lamps and making a right mess of the countryside. For near enough a century, this place is all about oily sludge and hard graft, employing people from Glasgow to Edinburgh, until it shut shop in 1956, The site's left a bit of a wasteland, with nobody gained at a second glance for decades. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and the SPS is dealing with a dated prison system, overcrowding, manky cells, and an environment that's a cross between porridge and train spotting. They need a new nick, and this old chemical work site smack bang between Glasgow and Edinburgh is the perfect spot. But why? The long and short of it is, right, it's got decent transport links, it's no too close to posh people at Moan, and it's big enough for a proper fortress. In January 2004, a 6-week public consultation kicks off, and by June 2006, contracts handed to a consortium led by Sodexo Justice Services, backed by Royal Bank Project Investments, for a £75 to £80 million private finance initiative deal, known as a PFI. A PFI is basically when the government doesn't want to pay for something up front, so they'll get a private company to build and manage it, and then the government rents it off them for years. Sounds dodgier than your granny's kneecaps. And it was. They were popular back in the 90s and early 2000s, but it got a lot of stick for its long-term cost to taxpayers and quality issues, leading to them being phased out. The plan for this PFI was to build a shiny learning prison for 700 adult male cons, convicted, remand and protection, with 96 extra spots in reserve. It was meant to be a game changer. On the 12th of December 2008, Addiewell opens his doors, ready to school its inmates and send them back to society as model citizens. But that didn't go quite to plan. The build itself is quite modern, right? There was no Victorian dungeon stuff here. Designed by HLM architects, Addiewell laid out with 2 massive 4-storey T-shaped house blocks, each with 3 spurs, which are basically halls spinning off them. Linked to be a central hub, they had 12 wings for single and double cells, plus special ones for disabled cons, separating remand, convicted and first offenders, long-termers and protection cases. There's even a separation and care unit for the real troublemakers, and a fancy L-shaped central building with a link centre for rehab programmes. The education and training block is packed right in the middle, and it's surrounded by a landscape courtyard, because the big idea that 40 hours a week of purposeful activity, learning skills, tackling bad habits, and cutting reoffending. Loads of natural light, bright colours, and extra classrooms in the house blocks made it feel less like a jail and more like a community college. Apart from the bars and the razor wire, of course. The entry building handled visits, admin, and the governor's suite, all streamlined for efficiency. Sodexo's going on about the peer support model, where cons act as mentors, helping run classes and sports. On the face of it, it sounds like a revolutionary approach to the prison system. But underneath the facade was a different story. Barely 2 months after HMP Addiewell opened its gates in December 12, 2008, trouble erupted. In February 8, 2009, 35 cons built barricades with pool tables, smashed furniture and even flat screen tellies. They got tooled up with pool cues, broom handles and sulks filled with pool balls, and turned the hall into a war zone. One con called Paul Jackson sent his cell alight, piling up pillow slips and toilet paper in a bonfire. The carnage lasted 3 hours, and it was one female screw that decided to lock the wing down to keep it from spreading. It worked. Livingston Sheriff Court later extended their jail time. Jackson got 3 years and 1 month for fire raising and breach of the peace, whilst Matthew Wilson and Kevin Kelly got 2 years and 4 months for breach of the peace. Sheriff Douglas Kinloch said the court must deter others for this behaviour. But did it? Surely at this point, yous are probably wide, dramatic pauses. 8 months later, in October 2009, another disturbance rocked Addiewell. Around 20 cons kicked off, although details on what sparked it are quite thin. What we do know is, right, it was bad enough to send a screw to the hospital. The jail was still kind of finding its feet. It was already at capacity with 700 cons. Your low, medium and high security plus remand cases. Reports hinted at overcrowding and staffing issues as the route, but the SPS kept quiet in specifics. The incident reported by Wikipedia was a red flag that Addiewell's modern setup wasn't enough to keep the peace. But this was nowhere near as bad as one of the worst standoffs. On January 25, 2010, Addiewell faced its biggest test to date. Up to 70 cons, some reports saying 100, barricaded themselves in Douglas B and C wings, kicking off a 5-hour standoff. 2 screws got injured, and the media, including the Scotsman, jumped on it, calling it a riot that exposed the jail's struggles. The cons caused an absolute commotion that needed Gaelic staff, which is Sodexo's brand at the time, to step in with control and restraint tactics. David Melrose for the Prisoner Officers Association blamed low staff levels in private jails, while Clive Fairweather, former Chief Inspector of Prisons, pointed to profit-driven corner cutting as the culprit. Fewer staff, low wages, less training, they said, hinting that this creates more problems. But was this the worst Addiewell would get? Fast forward to March 2017, and Addiewell's back in the headlines for a brutal episode. Two convicted murderers, William Lewis and Paul Deeney, went on a violent spree in the residential wing. Lewis was a triple murderer, branded evil, violent and highly dangerous by a judge, stabbed inmate Stuart Campbell twice in the face with a metal spike. Both Lewis and Deeney threatened screws with blades and sharpened spikes, running an absolute mock. At Livingston Sheriff Court, Lewis got an extra 3 years, whilst Deeney, already serving a 20-year term, got an R18 month. The Crown dropped other charges, including alleged attacks on other cons. But the incident showed how dangerous Addiewell could be. That same year, Addiewell hit a new high. This time it was a legal one. After 3 days in August 2017, 9 screws were rushed to hospital after inhaling spice, which was a synthetic drug cons were smoking like it was going out of fashion. The Daily Record was the first to break the story, describing screws collapsing or feeling ill after inhaling the toxic smoke, wafting through the wings. Cons were using spice openly, and the jail's ventilation system was no match. Sodexo called it a serious incident, but kept stewing details. By 2017, Addiewell had one of Scotland's worst drug records, with 206 suspected fines in its first year. It was in January 2018, where something as simple as snow lit the fuse for an R riot, and a Tuesday night, heavy snowfall hit central Scotland, known as the Beast for East. And don't get this confused with the top man of Peterhead, no. Prison bosses decided to lock down early 8 PM instead of the usual 10 PM, so the screws could go up the road. The cons, 28 of them, were having none of it. They rioted, smashing furniture and a pool table, and it took riot shields to bring them under control after 11 PM. Sodexo called it a peaceful protest, but the damage and disruption tell a different story. Some cons were transferred to our jails, and the incident raised eyebrows about staffing. By July 2019, Addiewell's reputation was taking an R hit. A routine medical check in the wing turned into a nightmare when a prisoner, most likely it was Carol Cox, went bananas. He grabbed a metal floor sweep and swung it like, quote unquote, a samurai sword, according to an insider. Nurses screamed and took cover. Some dragged to the floor like hedgehogs, apparently, to avoid the rampage. Screws and riot gear bounced in and disarmed the prisoner after a 10-minute standoff. Nobody was really hurt, but the fear was real. The incident, reported by the Scottish Sun, highlighted the dangers of managing inmates with substance issues in a jail already stretched thin. Then came March 23rd, 2020, when the world was balls deep into the coronavirus pandemic. At Addiewell, tensions boiled air. Up to 10 cons in 4D Hall rioted, shock, starting fires and vandalising the wing. A video popped up showing one con holding a Screws ID card and another one waving a metal rod when asked, "Where's your cosh?" 2 screws got injured and emergency services, including 5 fire engines, turned up. The cons had to put out the fire themselves before the fire service arrived, but the damage was done. The SPS reported the culprits to the police, and the jail was secured, but fears of a hostage situation lingered. The Daily Record noted the riot was fueled by anger over inmates with symptoms not being isolated. In 2021, Addiewell's reputation took another battering. A video popped up splashed across Edinburgh Live, showing a female screw getting far too cosy with a con, following winching in a cell. Police get involved, and unsurprisingly the lassie's employment get terminated. Imagine that. You get to jail for nipping somebody. But that same year, a 34-year-old con named Callum English contracted COVID. You see, Callum had asthma and respiratory issues. But what part did Addiewell play in this? That part was negligence. See, over the space of 12 days, right, Callum's condition got worse. He was breathing heavy, chest was agony, he was even coughing up blood. He used the buzzers, air and air again, begging to see a nurse. The screws repeatedly told him that he'd be seen in the morning. But did anybody ever turn up? No, nobody came. On the 24th of October, the screws opened his cell door and found him dead, alone and abandoned. His dad, Alan Inglis, said it was barbaric. And you know what? He's spot on, but here's where it gets heavy, right? After years of pushing, shouting and grief, in April 2025 the Lord Advocate finally stepped in, and both the Crown slaps charges in both HMP Addiewell and NHS Lothian. That's right, Scotland's first ever criminal prosecution to a private jail after a death in custody. It's not just a tragedy, it's a stain in the whole system. A man died asking for help that never came. No questions have been asked. Big ones. But Callum English was just one of the few victims to the confines of Addiewell. Another was Jordan Burns. Jordan Burns was only 22, a young boy who stuck in remand in HMP Addiewell, waiting to face assault charges. Instead of a court date, he got a coffin. As Maud Janice said it straight, Addiewell sentenced my son to death. And once you hear what happened, you'll see she's not been dramatic. See, Jordan was screaming for help in every way possible. He tried jumping off balconies, OD'd multiple times, even set fire to his own cell. At one point, he sliced open his own throat and then phoned his lawyer whilst he was bleeding, telling him he was done waiting for the mental health support that never came. And still, no support, no meds, no care. The prison knew he had PTSD and ADHD. They knew he tried to take his life before, but when he died on the 10th of November 2023 for a drug overdose in his cell, he wasn't even on suicide watch. They literally stopped checking on a suicidal boy who already tried to end it multiple times. As Moss says, she never even got a proper phone call. Prison screws turned up at her door, stayed 15 minutes, and then left her with nothing but questions. They even gave her the wrong details for the morgue. She had to hunt her own boy down just to say goodbye. And we're the criminals. You telling me that's care? Addiewell's ran by Sodexo, a private firm making millions. And when they're not meeting their performance indicators, they just pay a fine, then hand 1.5 million in dividends to shareholders. Meanwhile, young men like Jordan are dying behind the walls. Since Jordan's death, there's been 14 more deaths in Addiewell. 14. His family's now suing the jail, and they should. But let's be honest, when it's a private jail that's funded by tax but run like a business, justice is near impossible. Amir Anwar says it best. The prison effectively sanctioned a death sentence, and for that, they should face prosecution. And let's not forget, this isn't just a one-off. In 2023, 64 people died in Scottish jails. The average age was just 49. Mental health services are graded at a D by international rights monitors. There's no help in there, just punishment. And whilst the SBS hides behind the phrase natural causes, we've got research telling us that suicides are on the rise and support is either non-existent or it comes too late. Professor Sarah Armstrong said it clearly. In every suicide case in 2024, people were asking for help, but didn't get it. So tell me this, who's really got blood in their hands? The big incidents grab headlines, but Addiewell's had a constant pulse of violence. In 2022, the Ferret reported 166 assaults with prisoners, including attacks with razor blades and boiling water. 44 of these were on staff, and 29 were deemed serious, more than any other Scottish prison. The jail holding 701 cons was outpacing even Barlinnie in serious assaults. But here's the kicker, right? There was insiders claiming incidents were dramatically underreported due to fear of a backlash and poor management. Complaints were going missing, and a culture of violence, fear and intimidation was said to be rampant. So does this mean that the staff in Addiewell were just as guilty of violence as the cons? In 2023, an inspection by HM Inspectorate at Prisons for Scotland shook things up. 40% of inmates, near enough half, said they'd been abused, threatened, bullied or assaulted by staff. 60% claimed they'd seen it happen to others. Chief Inspector Wendy Sinclair Gibbon called it the worst findings in a 5-year. The report pointed to chronic staff shortages and inexperienced officers as culprits, with relationships between staff and cons at rock bottom. The Ferret followed up, alleging the situation was even worse, with covering up of violent incidents and complaints even vanishing. But it seemed in some cases it was tit for tat between the screws and the cons. In that same year, 6 screws motors were firebombed in the jail's own car park. A deliberate, coordinated attack, no accident, no coincidence. We're talking petrol bombs here. Now let's not beat about the bush. It was clearly a message, whether it was a warden for inside the jail or an outside mob sending a signal. Things were clear. Somebody wanted the screws to feel vulnerable, even outside there was. According to the Herald, this was the latest in a series of violent incidents that plagued Addiewell, a prison already accused of being overstretched, under-supervised and riddled with chaos. So when the very people that are meant to keep order are scared to park their motors at work, you have to ask yourself, who's really running the show in Addiewell? Addiewell's history of violence, riots, assaults and even deaths paint a troubled picture. The jail's modern setup, with its learning prison promise, has been overshadowed by overcrowding, staff shortages and allegations of gang control. Whistleblowers in 2021 claimed gangs were running the show, with guards turning a blind eye to illegal activities. By 2023, the jail reserve capacity 103%, making rehabilitation and safety even harder, according to MSP Liam MacArthur. Sodexo insists on investing in staff training and safety, but critics, including the Scottish Government, question whether private prisons can deliver. The old Justice Secretary Kenny McCaskill once said prisons are for public safety and not private profit. Yet Addiewell's contract runs to 2034, another 9 years to either break its cycle of violence or draw more blood on its violent, chaotic history. So there you have it. The raw, unfiltered history of violence, via a CD player spark in 2009 to a deadly assault in 2024. This jail's been a battleground of riots, stabbings and fear. And a wee smooching on, oh. So there you have it, troops. For the old days of public floggings in Bridewells, to the cold grey slabs of Barlinnie and Peterhead, to the private sector play part that is Addiewell, we've taken a guided tour through Scotland's system of state-sanctioned silence. We've heard about the cages that started it all. We've walked through riots, hostage-taking, murder, scandal, brutality, and mere lockdowns in a COVID calendar. We've named the jails, we've named the deed, and named the shamed. We've seen men tortured and dragged like animals, families broken, and justice buried under corporate immunity and bureaucratic shite. We've clocked the prisons that claim to rehabilitate, but can't even give out hot water or mental health meds. Every prison we've covered, Stockton, Polmont, Glenochil, Low Moss, Shotts, Addiewell, tells you the same thing in a different accent. The system isn't built to heal, it's built to contain, to forget and punish. And aye, some people probably do deserve to be behind bars. Nobody's saying any different. When jails are bursting at the seams, people are sleeping in mattresses and flares, and the screws are running on caffeine and trauma, you need to ask yourself, right, is this justice or organised cruelty? We're in 2025 and yet we're still dealing with 18th century ideas in 21st century buildings. Overcrowding, understaffing, a revolving door for the broken and abandoned. No strategy, no vision, just reaction. And whilst politicians fight our figures and fob you halfway policy soundbites, there's young boys hanging themselves and grieving maws, burying wains that the system forgot. Scotland's prison system isn't just cracked, it's bleeding. But here's the thing, this podcast, this was only the start. The past is mapped, the stories are told, but the future is still unwritten. They can lock the locks, but they can't stop the clocks. I'm Hawaii 5-0, and this is Patsy Crime. Like, subscribe, and don't get wide. Catch you!